Agar pembukaan Diklat Teknis Penerjemahan Lisan Angkatan 5 dapat berjalan dengan lancar, marilah sejenak kita menundukkan kepala dan membaca doa sesuai dengan keyakinan masing-masing. Berdoa dipersilakan. Selesai? Selanjutnya marilah kita menyanyikan lagu kebangsaan Indonesia Raya dan Mars Sekretariat Kabinet. Hadirin dimohon untuk berdiri.
Sekretariat Kabinet Indonesia selaras langkah abdi negara, mendukung dan melayani pemerintah demi rakyat berdaulat dan sejahtera. Dasar Ketuk Negara, bukit prestasi karya dan gemilang, dengan semangat profesional dan andal, bersama kita bangun Indonesia. Buatkan mereka punya tekan beribu, tingkatkan kinerja bangun negeri, dengan rahmat Tuhan yang Maha Kuasa, Sekretariat Kabinet Jaya. Sekretariat Kabinet Indonesia selaras langkah abdi negara, mendukung dan melayani pemerintah demi rakyat berdaulat dan sejahtera. Hati tulus Diklat Ketuk Negara, bukit prestasi karya dan gemilang, dengan semangat profesional dan andal, bersama kita bangun Indonesia. Buatkan mereka punya takat hatimu, tingkatkan kinerja bangun negeri, dengan rahmat Tuhan yang Maha Kuasa, Sekretariat Kabinet Jaya.
Hadirin dipersilakan duduk kembali. Yang terhormat PLH Deputi Bidang Administrasi, Ibu Heni Nafila. Yang terhormat Kepala Bidang Program dan Pengembangan Ibu Indriawati. Yang terhormat Kepala Bagian Tata Usaha Bapak Tarmuji. Yang kami hormati Bapak Ibu pejabat seluruh tamu undangan dari lingkungan Sekretariat Kabinet. Yang kami hormati Bapak Ibu pimpinan dan atasan dari peserta Diklat. Yang kami hormati Ibu Direktur Lembaga Bahasa Internasional Universitas Indonesia atau yang mewakili. Yang kami hormati pembicara utama Diklat Teknis Penerjemahan Lisan, Ibu Mariana Molnar Gaborwaroka. Yang kami hormati para pengajar Diklat Teknis Penerjemahan Lisan dan para peserta Diklat Teknis Penerjemahan Lisan Angkatan 5 tahun 2023 yang kami banggakan. Selanjutnya, mari kita bersama-sama mendengarkan sambutan Deputi Administrasi yang akan dibacakan oleh Kepala Biro Sumber Daya Manusia, Organisasi, dan Tata Laksana, dan akan sekaligus membuka secara resmi kegiatan Diklat Teknis Penerjemahan Lisan Angkatan 5 tahun 2023. Kepada Ibu Heni Nafila, kami persilakan.
Baik, terima kasih Pak Aisi. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Selamat pagi, salam sejahtera, sehat untuk kita semuanya. Yang kami hormati pembicara utama Diklat Lisan Angkatan 5 tahun 2023, Ibu Dr. Mariana Molnar Gaborwaroka SHMH, yang beliau ini merupakan praktisi penerjemahan lisan pengadilan. Terima kasih Ibu telah meluangkan waktu untuk mengisi Diklat pada sesi kali ini. Yang kami hormati Direktur Lembaga Bahasa Internasional UI atau yang mewakili. Yang kami hormati para pengajar Diklat Lisan dari LBI UI. Yang kami hormati para pejabat, pegawai di lingkungan Sekretariat Kabinet. Tadi ada Ibu Asdek Master juga yang hadir. Selamat pagi Ibu. Kemudian yang kami hormati tentunya seluruh tamu undangan dan juga peserta Diklat Lisan Penerjemahan pada periode kali ini. Semoga seluruh acara dapat berjalan dengan lancar. Mengutip pendapat dari pakar penerjemahan dari University of Leeds Inggris, Jeremy Munde, beliau mengatakan bahwa throughout history, written and spoken have played a crucial role in interhuman communication, not least in providing access to important texts for collective and religious purposes. Apa yang beliau sampaikan ini menegaskan bahwa sepanjang sejarah, penerjemahan baik secara lisan ataupun tertulis memainkan peranan yang sangat penting dalam komunikasi antar manusia, baik dalam akses terhadap teks yang penting untuk pendidikan ataupun juga untuk keagamaan. Kami dari Sekretariat Kabinet selaku instansi pembina, dalam hal ini adalah Pusat Pembinaan Penerjemahan, tentunya sangat berbangga hati bahwa posisi penting penerjemah itu memegang peranan yang sangat-sangat vital, melekat di hati, karena punya peran yang sangat penting baik dalam kancah regional, nasional, ataupun internasional. Dapat kita lihat bahwa peran penerjemah itu sangat vital dalam posisi-posisi Indonesia dalam forum internasional. Antara lain, Indonesia yang dipercaya menjadi tuan rumah seperti KTT G20, KTT ke-42 tahun 2023, dan juga tahun 2024 mendatang, sangat memerlukan peran dari penerjemah. Dan ini menaikkan peran dan pendapat mata dunia internasional terhadap posisi bangsa Indonesia. Begitu pentingnya peran dari pejabat fungsional penerjemah di dalam pelaksanaan tugas fungsi pembangunan bangsa Indonesia ini. Dengan semakin maraknya interaksi antara negara sahabat dan mitra pembangunan, maka tentunya sistem komunikasi dan informasi itu berkembang semakin canggih, sehingga membuat dunia semakin membutuhkan peran penerjemah. Karena pertukaran informasi yang sangat cepat meningkatkan kontak-kontak di segala bidang. Kami percaya bahwa pelaksanaan diklat teknis penerjemahan lisan bagi penerjemah itu merupakan investasi yang sangat berharga untuk turut mensukseskan komunikasi dan informasi tersebut. Selaku instansi pembina Jabatan Fungsional Penerjemah, kami di Sekretariat Kabinet, tepatnya di Pusat Pembinaan Penerjemah, sangat menyadari betul peran dari penerjemah tersebut, sehingga kami setiap tahun melaksanakan diklat penerjemahan baik lisan ataupun secara tertulis dalam rangka mempersiapkan penerjemah yang kompeten, handal, dan profesional. Karena kali ini merupakan diklat lisan, tentunya diklat kali ini berharap bahwa penerjemah yang dihasilkan dan yang telah mengikuti diklat penerjemahan lisan kali ini akan menjadi penerjemah yang handal, yang mampu untuk memiliki pengetahuan dan keahlian yang komprehensif, mampu menguasai bahasa sumber dan sasaran dengan baik. Diklat lisan ini telah diselenggarakan oleh Sekretariat Kabinet setiap tahun, baik tingkat dasar ataupun tingkat lanjutan, yang wajib diikuti oleh seluruh penerjemah. Karena penerjemah ini akan dibekali pengetahuan baik secara teoritis ataupun secara praktek. Sehingga penerjemah ini dapat siap ditugaskan oleh pimpinan untuk menjadi penerjemah, terutama penerjemah lisan, di instansi masing-masing. Perlu untuk teman-teman ketahui, terutama peserta ya, bahwa peserta yang terbaik dari Diklat Teknis Penerjemahan Lisan Angkatan 5 tahun 2023 ini nanti akan mengikuti Diklat Lisan Lanjutan tahun 2023 yang rencananya akan diselenggarakan oleh Sekretariat Kabinet pada bulan September tahun 2023. Diklat lisan lanjutan itu akan dilaksanakan secara tatap muka dan karena memang prakteknya itu akan dilaksanakan secara simultan interpreting booths, jadi nanti akan disampaikan dalam bahasa Inggris. Untuk mempersingkat waktu, pesan kami kepada seluruh peserta agar menggunakan diklat teknis ini dengan sebaik mungkin, karena yang mengikuti diklat teknis angkatan 2 ini merupakan penerjemah pilihan dari berbagai instansi pengguna, baik pusat atau daerah. Jadi memang peserta kali ini adalah peserta yang terpilih. Jadi kami mohon seluruh peserta yang mengikuti diklat ini dapat betul-betul memanfaatkan kesempatan ini dengan sebaik-baiknya, menyerap semua ilmu pengetahuan yang diberikan oleh pakar-pakar yang memang sudah qualified di bidangnya untuk kemudian mempertinggi kompetensi teman-teman penerjemah untuk menjadi pejabat fungsional penerjemah yang memang makin berkiprah baik secara regional, nasional maupun internasional. Baik, langsung saja saya mewakili Deputi Bidang Administrasi mengucapkan terima kasih kepada seluruh panitia dan semua pihak sehingga acara ini dapat terlaksana dari awal sampai dengan akhir dengan lancar, dengan sebaik-baiknya, dan menghasilkan penerjemah handal yang memang terbaik untuk negara ini. Kemudian dengan mengucap Bismillahirrahmanirrahim, Diklat Teknis Penerjemahan Lisan Angkatan 5 tahun 2023, saya nyatakan resmi dibuka. Demikian Bapak Ibu yang kami hormati, seluruh peserta yang kami sayangi, kami tutup sambutan yang mewakili Bapak Deputi Bidang Administrasi ini. Semoga semua dilancarkan dari awal sampai dengan akhir. Sehat selalu tanpa halangan apapun. Berkah dari Tuhan Yang Maha Kuasa. Selamat pagi, salam sejahtera. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Terima kasih Ibu Heni Nafila. Bapak Ibu hadirin yang kami hormati, terima kasih atas partisipasi Bapak Ibu dalam acara pembukaan Diklat Teknis Penerjemahan Lisan Angkatan 5 tahun 2023. Kami mohon maaf jika terdapat kekurangan dan kesalahan dalam penyelenggaraan dan dalam memandu jalannya acara hari ini. Semoga Bapak Ibu sehat dan sukses selalu. Salam sejahtera. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Bapak Ibu sekalian, sebelum kita akhiri acara hari ini, mohon kesediaan Bapak dan Ibu untuk berfoto bersama yang akan dipandu oleh Bapak Yoga. Kepada Bapak Yoga kami persilakan.
Baik Bapak Ibu, saya akan menghitung 1-3 dan per slide. Mohon dinyalakan semua kameranya. 1, 2, 3. Baik, sekali lagi. 1, 2, 3. Oke, slide kedua. 1, 2, 3. Sekali lagi. 1, 2, 3. Baik, terima kasih Bapak Ibu.
Terima kasih Bapak Yoga. Terima kasih banyak atas kesediaan Bapak dan Ibu semua untuk berfoto bersama. Kami persilakan untuk moderator kita hari ini untuk memandu jalannya hari pertama Diklat. Kepada Bapak Tarmuji, kami persilakan.
Baik, terima kasih Mbak Risa. Cek sound, apa kedengaran suaranya Mbak Risa?
Terdengar jelas Bapak?
Baik, terima kasih. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Yang kami hormati Bapak Ibu peserta Diklat Teknis Penerjemahan Lisan Angkatan 5 tahun 2023 yang hadir. Pada kesempatan pagi hari ini, bahagia sekali saya bisa mengantarkan Bapak Ibu sekalian untuk bersama-sama mengikuti Diklat Teknis Penerjemahan Lisan Angkatan 5 tahun 2023. Semoga Bapak Ibu sekalian selalu dalam keadaan sehat. Jadi ini semuanya masih agak tegang ya. Kita santai saja Bapak Ibu sekalian. Dan pada kesempatan ini mesti dalam suasana Lebaran, izinkan kami atas nama Pusat Pembinaan Penerjemahan mengucapkan minal aidin wal faizin, mohon maaf lahir batin atas segala kesalahan dan kekurangan selama ini. Bapak dan Ibu sekalian, pada Diklat kali ini kami akan menghadirkan narasumber yang sangat berkompeten di bidangnya, yaitu Ibu Dr. Mariana Moinar Gabor, Warka SHMH. Selamat pagi Ibu.
Selamat pagi Pak Sutarji, terima kasih.
Terima kasih Ibu telah meluangkan waktu di sela-sela kesibukan Ibu.
Dengan senang hati.
Ya, salam kenal juga Ibu ya, biar semuanya akrab dengan para peserta Ibu. Jadi pembelajaran akan berjalan dengan hangat dan lancar Bu ya. Ya.
Amin.
Mungkin seperti disampaikan bahwa kami menyadari bahwa peranan penerjemah ini sangat strategis dan penting, terutama dalam mendukung kelancaran program-program pemerintahan. Untuk itu, kami Pusbiner selalu berusaha untuk meningkatkan kompetensi, dan setiap tahun kami mengadakan Diklat untuk meningkatkan kompetensi dan menciptakan penerjemah yang handal dan profesional. Baiklah, Bapak Ibu sekalian, tamat berlama-lama, mungkin selanjutnya kami serahkan kepada Ibu untuk menyampaikan paparannya terkait dengan materi yang akan disampaikan pada pagi hari ini. Kami persilakan Ibu untuk dapat dimulai saat ini. Terima kasih Ibu, silakan.
Terima kasih banyak Matur Nuwun Bapak dan Ibu yang saya hormati. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Salam sejahtera buat kita semua. Om Swastiastu. Om. Terima kasih banyak atas kesempatan yang diberikan kepada saya oleh penyelenggara Diklat ini. Saya senang sekali berada dengan Ibu dan Bapak, teman-teman sejawat ya, penerjemah dari seluruh Indonesia. Penerjemahan merupakan satu boleh dikatakan bukan sebuah pekerjaan ya bagi saya, tetapi sebuah hobi dari zaman dulu, dari sejak 1990-an atau 80-an bahkan sampai saat ini. Dan saya sangat bersyukur saya memiliki sebuah satu hobi, suatu talenta atau satu ketertarikan dengan bidang ini, karena dalam kenyataannya bidang ini membawa saya pada suatu pengembangan diri yang luar biasa. So, sekian mungkin dari saya dalam bahasa Indonesia, karena saya diminta untuk mengantarkan ataupun menyampaikan materi dalam bahasa Inggris, maka mohon maaf saya akan menggunakan bahasa Inggris sebagai bahasa pengantar. Tetapi sebelumnya saya hanya ingin mengucapkan ataupun mengungkapkan ya rasa syukur saya atas kesempatan ini yang sangat berharga ini untuk berbicara tentang profesi yang memang sesuatu yang tidak pernah ada habisnya ya, tidak pernah ada habisnya kalau kita membicarakan itu. Saya mohon maaf juga tidak akan mencoba untuk tidak terlalu teoritis, meskipun harus ada teori juga sedikit banyak, tetapi saya juga akan mencoba mengambil pendekatan pragmatis. Jadi saya akan mencoba untuk berbagi pengalaman saya juga, sebagian pengalaman saya, dan barangkali kalau masih ada waktu kita bisa mengadakan sedikit tanya jawab, atau bisa saja Anda mengajukan pertanyaan ketika saya sedang menyampaikan materi yang saya siapkan untuk hari ini. Terus terang saya mengalami kesulitan karena begitu banyak hal yang ingin saya sampaikan, tentu saja dalam jangka waktu kurang dari 2 jam, ini tidak semua bisa saya sampaikan. Tetapi sesuai dengan topik yang diberikan kepada saya oleh panitia, dipercayakan kepada saya oleh panitia, yaitu peran strategis penerjemah lisan atau juru bahasa dalam penerjemahan di bidang hukum dan di pengadilan. Akan saya coba sampaikan mengenai itu dengan diilustrasikan dengan beberapa pengalaman pribadi saya. Untuk itu saya dengan senang hati akan menjawab pertanyaan atau mungkin komentar kalau ada, dan dengan demikian saya mengajak ya para peserta untuk secara proaktif bertanya, silakan bertanya, karena kemungkinan besar Anda juga mengalami hal-hal yang serupa serupa dengan apa yang akan saya sampaikan. With that in mind, I would like to give back to the opportunity to the moderator. Would you like to introduce me, or should I start with my presentation right away, Pak Tarmuji?
Ya, Ibu.
Would you like me to start with the presentation, or would you like to introduce me first?
Ibu,
yes,
saja, Ibu,
thank
silakan.
you. Yeah.
Mungkin,
baik.
Mungkin Ibu
ya?
mohon izin Ibu sebentar, mungkin akan kami bacakan sedikit tadi kelewat Ibu resume dari Ibu ya.
Yes, yeah, thank you.
Lebih akrab dengan Ibu ya.
Iya, terima kasih Pak.
Izin, nama Ibu Dr. Mariana Moinar Jabor Warta SHMH, riwayat pendidikan, sarjana S1 dari Universitas Al-Azhar Indonesia, Fakultas Ekonomi dan Hukum Teknologi tahun 2010. Kemudian S2 dari Fakultas Hukum Universitas Indonesia tahun 2012. Kemudian Doktor Ilmu Hukum tahun 2018 dari Fakultas Hukum Universitas Indonesia. Kemudian Sworn Translator tahun 1995 dan dari Universitas Indonesia dan Local Government of DKI Jakarta, Field of Specialization, Law English Indonesia English, kemudian Degree of the Governor of DKI Jakarta, nomor 527 tahun 95, kemudian Professional Background, Sworn Translator and Interpreter in the Field of Law English Indonesia, tahun 1999, to date, including court interpreting at Indonesian District Court, Constitutional Court, Tax Court, KPPU, Anti-Monopoly and Unfair Business Competition Supervisory agency hearing, BANI, Indonesia National Arbitration Board hearing, SIAC, Singapore International Arbitration Center, proceeding, conference, interpreting in legal training, business negotiations, and other setting requiring language assistance. Interpreter, consecutive and simultaneous in various international conferences, meeting, bilateral and multilateral talks, negotiation, and state parliamentary event visit. Demikian sekilas resume dari Ibu Mariana. Kami persilakan Ibu untuk langsung menyampaikan materinya. Langsung Ibu nanti mungkin ada tanya jawab Ibu ya. Sementara Ibu nanti memberikan paparan dulu. Nanti ada sesi, kita bagi 2 sesi atau berapa sesuai dengan peserta yang ikut pelatihan ini, Bu. Silakan Ibu.
Terima kasih banyak. Baik, akan saya coba share barangkali screen saya atau bagaimana? Apakah dari panitia mungkin? Atau saya coba share?
Saya sudah menyeting agar Ibu bisa share screen, Bu.
Saya bisa share?
Ya, bisa.
Baik,
Ibu.
akan saya langsung coba slideshow. Slideshow, very well. So there we go. So first of all, I would like to again thank for the opportunity to be here and share with you some experiences and some knowledge about the role of interpreters in the field of law and in court interpreting, more notably. I understand that the participants of this training seminar are all of you are officially recognized government interpreters, translators, and or interpreters. So I think it is a great opportunity for us to understand a little bit more about the differences between written translation and interpretation, and more specifically to understand what we as interpreters are expected to do or not to do in a setting where we have to interpret law-related subjects and or to interpret in a court hearing. So this is going to be, I would like to divide my talk into 4 or 5 parts. After introduction, I would like to give you some working definitions, and then I would like to talk about the position of and role of interpreters based on the law, which is important, which will make us understand, perhaps, which will lead us to the understanding about the significant role that and the recognition by the Indonesian government for the role of your role as translators and interpreters, as was so very well said by Ms. Henny in her opening speech. And then I will talk a little bit about the role of interpreters in law, in interpreting about law-related subjects, and also court interpreting. I would also like to give you some case studies so that we can learn together from these case studies. And of course, I would like to convey some final thoughts in the conclusion part. So let us now start with the working definitions. Of course, I would like to make sure that we understand what is an interpreter, what is communication, what is law, and what is the judicial system. I believe that these we need to understand these terms before we actually start to begin talking about the role of interpreters in this particular setting. So working the definition, so juru bahasa or interpreter, we can look it up in a general definition in the KBBI, Kamus Besar Bahasa Indonesia, but we can also look at the other general definitions. For example, I will be relying on this one taken from the Encyclopedia Britannica Dictionary. Interpreter is a person who translates the words that someone is speaking into a different language, and interpreting is the transfer of one spoken or signed language to another. Interpreters work in a wide range of different settings, from international conferences to and business meetings to courts and doctors' surgeries, for example. So in this case, I will be focusing my talk on the law-related topics, interpreting law-related topics, and court interpreting. And I would like to also place that in the context of your position as officially recognized government interpreters. And of course, there was an interesting and very important word mentioned by Ms. Henny in her opening remarks about communication. So looking at interpretation or interpreting, or interpreters, not as parrots, quote unquote, parrots, yeah, but as people, as means of communicating the message. And communication, again, is the exchange of meanings between individuals through a common system of symbols. So we need to understand that we are not translating in the context of communication, interpreters as communicators. We are not interpreting only words mechanically as parrots. Rather than that, we are exchanging, we facilitate the exchange of meanings between individuals through a common system of symbols, in this case, through language. So that was the definition of communication, which we are going to use, which I'm going to use throughout my presentation. And then, of course, because we are talking, the main topic of today's talk is your role as interpreters in interpreting law-related subjects, and also interpreting perhaps in a court setting. So we need to understand, being perhaps some of you are also lawyers, but some of you may be graduates or experts in other fields. But law, we need to understand what law is. And the general definition that I would like to offer here is that law is a discipline and profession concerned with the customs, practices, and rules of conduct of a community that are recognized as binding by the community. And enforcement of the body of rules is through a controlling authority. So there are many different definitions of law, and so maybe the key words here would be the customs, kebiasaan, and practices, praktek, and the rules of conduct. Jadi perilaku, kode perilaku, which are recognized, yang diakui in a community, dalam sebuah masyarakat, and those rules are enforced. That is the law. So those laws are enforced through a controlling authority. Of course, we have to understand in the Indonesian context that there is written law and there is unwritten law. There are many types of law. There is civil law, criminal law. There is also customary law. There is a religious law, and customary law particularly is maybe written or unwritten, but it is still a law which needs to be taken into account by the judiciary when they are making their decisions. So this is about law, a very broad and very general definition. Of course, here in the Indonesian language, you can also say, well, you can also look it up in the big Indonesian dictionary. In this context, since you are government, since you are government interpreters and translators, you are bound to come into situations where, when interpreting about law-related subjects, you will come into contact with international law, either directly or indirectly. And so we need to understand what is international law as opposed to the national law that I just mentioned to you. International law is also called public international law or law of nations, the body of legal rules, norms, and standards that apply between sovereign states and other entities that are legally recognized as international actors. And the term was coined by English philosopher Gerald Bentham in the 17th, 18th century. So international law, of course, why is it important for us to understand? Because as you will realize, when you translate or interpret in a setting where it is related to the law, you may come into contact with several different legal systems. And the several legal systems will also imply several different legal terminology used. Excuse me. The legal terminology used will also be different. So you are not going to translate or interpret only words again, but you're going to have to understand legal concepts, legal terms, which reflect those legal concepts, which may be the same, but may have different connotations and different meanings in a particular legal system. For example, the concept of trust in the common law system is known, but not so much in the continental, European continental law system. So there is not an exact equivalent for trust. It could be per vali amanatan, etc. You may have the exact word for that, the equivalent, the linguistic equivalent for that term, but you need to understand what a trust in common law really means. So this is one of the examples that I wanted to mention to you, when you will have to also think about translating, interpreting not only words across languages, but not only across cultures, but also across legal systems. Now, what are the sources of international law? We need to understand that, of course, these are international conventions, international custom, the general principles of law as recognized by civilized nations, and the judicial decisions and teachings of the most highly qualified publicists in the various nations as subsidiary means for the determination of the rules of law. So this is the sources of international law are defined in the statute establishing the International Court of Justice, or ICJ, and this is a general accepted definition of the sources of international law. So in other words, why is it important for us to look at this definition? Is because definitely when you are working I'm just trying to think about a situation where you as a government interpreter are required to interpret, for example, in an international conference where talks are being held for the formation of an international convention. And of course, Indonesia, as was mentioned also very appropriately by Ms. Henny Ibu Henny in her opening speech, Indonesia is playing an increasingly important, significant role in the international community. It is gaining a reputation, it is gaining, so to say, posture, it is gaining a very important role. And as such, of course, Indonesia's voice needs to be heard in these discussions, in these negotiations. And of course, the international negotiations are normally conducted in English, but it is also possible for the delegations to use Indonesian if they can provide appropriate professional interpretation, and that has a kind of a function of introducing, in a way, the Indonesian language. And so this is where you, as government interpreters, can come to assist your superior, can assist the Indonesian delegation to in conducting these international negotiations for the formation of international conventions. I would like to mention only one very striking example of how Indonesia had actually contributed to the formation of an international convention, which is the UNCLOS, the United Nations Law of the Sea. And that was a direct contribution from the late Professor Mokhtar Kusumatmaja and his visionary and inputs in that. And that has to make us very proud. And of course, by understanding the importance of international conventions and Indonesia's role in contributing thoughts, ideas to the formation of the international conventions, I think that will open up a new area where you as government interpreters can come into play. And I'm still talking about definitions, but I would like to also share with you, for example, how the role of interpreters can assist or actually hamper the flow of negotiations. I have had the opportunity to be part of an interpreters team where we were actually interpreting simultaneously, and of course some of the participants of the negotiation were from countries which the speakers simply did not speak English, like Vietnamese or some other perhaps Thai, and they all had their interpreters there to interpret into English, and it was relayed to us, and we had to then interpret it to Indonesian and vice versa. So this is an important. I think this is a international conventions, the negotiations for the formation of international conventions, and Indonesia's role in it opens up an opportunity for you as government interpreters to play an important role, and to actually facilitate the uninterrupted flow of those negotiations. Then international custom. So it is and the general principles of law, as recognized by civilized nations, and judicial decisions. And this is where we have to understand the difference between the legal system, the judicial decisions, depending on where those decisions were made. Let me go on to the next slide. So in addition to that, we also need to understand what is the judiciary system. We need to understand what is the judiciary system nationally in Indonesia. The international judiciary system, which, well, indeed, there are certain courts, international courts, but there is no court of universal jurisdiction so far. But let's have a look at the judiciary system in Indonesia, because of course, when you might be requested or required to do interpreting in court, you certainly need to understand a little bit about the way it works, how the judiciary system in Indonesia works, and basically the judiciary power and judiciary bodies based on the constitutional basis. It consists of the Supreme Court, the Constitutional Court, and the Judicial Commission. So why is it important for you to understand? Because basically, whenever you are required to do interpreting in a court, you need to understand what is the position of the court for which you are requested to interpret. So the Supreme Court, under the Supreme Court, we have the courts of general jurisdiction, Pengadilan Negeri, kemudian Pengadilan Tinggi, and we have the State Administration Court, PT1, Pengadilan Tata Usaha Negara. We have the Military Court and the Religious Court. So all of these we need to understand. So we have to map when we receive an assignment for interpreting, especially in court, we need to understand the setting within which we are required to do our to play our role as interpreters. And of course, there are special courts as well. It would be basically the juvenile court, the commercial court, the human rights court, the anti-corruption court, industrial relations court, tax court, fisheries court, maritime court, customary court for example, in Papua. And this is just to mention a few. And all of these courts will have to probably have the similar procedure taking place. However, of course, the cases will be different, and the terminology used will be different. So even if when we talk about interpreting for law-related subjects or interpreting in the court, we still cannot say that even if I'm, let's say, a sworn translator in the field of law, from English into Indonesian, Indonesian to English, I have been certified by the governor, and I would like to show you my oath taking minutes of the oath taking. Maybe it's not very visible, but well, that's what. Even though I have graduated, I have studied law for 12 years in a row, and I have a doctoral degree in the field of law, I cannot say that I am a specialist or that I'm an expert in any of these areas. And as an interpreter, especially, I have to understand that when I act as interpreter, I have to just take off my hat as a lawyer, and I have to interpret the way professionally, and also I have to prepare for the interpretation session. So each of these areas, courts will handle different cases, and they will have to, you have to prepare, and that will be the key later on. Now let's look at the international courts and tribunals. Again, there are tribunals of universal jurisdiction, such as the International Court of Justice, International Criminal Court, International Labor Organization Administrative Tribunal, International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea, the Permanent Court of Arbitration, the World Bank International Center for the Settlement of Investment Disputes, also the World Intellectual Property Organization Arbitration and Mediation Center. So let's see, then the next one is still the international courts and tribunals. Perhaps there is a delay yes. And of course, there are also ad hoc criminal tribunals and special courts in the international sphere, such as the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, for the former Yugoslavia, the residual special court for Sierra Leone, etc. And then there is also the Nuremberg war crime trials. Why do we need to understand this? And of course, there are regional courts. One of them is the European Court of Human Rights. I would like to point out the Court of Conciliation and Arbitration Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. So the regional courts are basically the European-based courts, European Free Trade Agreement Court, Guide to, and then Inter-American Court of Human Rights. So these are some regional courts in the international context. Now, in addition to court interpreting, you might be required to assist your department, to assist the government, the Indonesian government, to interpret in an arbitration proceeding. And arbitration, of course, is not a court. It's an alternative dispute resolution medium or forum, whereby there are certain rules. The panel of arbitrators is actually chosen by the parties. It is chosen in their agreement. So there is an arbitration clause in an agreement. And if the parties choose to resolve their disputes through arbitration, then they have to state it in the agreement which arbitration body they would like to settle or their disputes through, and of course the language in which the arbitration will be conducted. And also it has to, if once the parties choose to settle their disputes, potential disputes through arbitration, then they have no way, they cannot go to the court. So they have to comply with their agreement and go through alternative dispute resolution, namely through arbitration. And this is potentially where you as government interpreters can be asked to assist. For example, if the government is one of the parties in the arbitration proceeding, for example, in a mining case, or in an environmental case, or in a, let's say, just a contract case, contract-related case. So there are various arbitration bodies which can be chosen, and it depends, of course, depends on the agreement between the parties. There is the International Chamber of Commerce, International Court of Arbitration, London Court of International Arbitration, Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague, Singapore International Arbitration Center. And of course, there is also the Indonesian Arbitration Board, or BANI. And even though it is in Indonesia, even if the parties choose to go through BANI to settle their dispute outside the court, still the Indonesian language may not be sufficient, because if your client, in this case the government, has contracted with a foreign multinational company, for example, and they have a dispute, ongoing dispute, and it is brought to the conciliation of the Indonesian Arbitration Board as provided for in the agreement, then of course you will probably have to assist the Council of the Arbitrators, which sometimes can be foreign nationals as well, and it is depending on the party's choice. And so you may be requested to assist the arbitrators, panel of arbitrators, by interpreting for example, the testimony or the witness or the expert testimony in that particular case, in this case perhaps coming from the government's part. And I have actually had experience doing that, and indeed it is I can say that it's a very responsible, highly responsible task. But I think if we are professionals, we have to understand that regardless of the parties involved, regardless of the setting, regardless of the importance of the case, every case is important. but we have to do our job professionally, and that's how we establish our role as interpreters in the field of law and in court interpreting. So again, I would not like to talk too much perhaps about the position and function on interpreters, in this case, your function and position, because the Indonesian government has done a great job. It has taken a huge leap forward since the time I was first sworn in as a sworn translator in 1995. So at that time, I was developing I was trying to contribute to the development of this profession. And I realized that there was a gap, there was a lack of training for translators and interpreters, particularly interpreters, at the, both formal and informal training. And at the time, I was actually leading a company, a consulting company, which was providing translation and interpretation services. And some of our clients included government agencies. And it was at that time that I realized that, well, I think the Indonesian government would need to have the position of the interpreters who are able to assist from within the agency, from within the department, from within the institution, for several reasons. Because first of all, as I mentioned, each area, each department would be dealing with specific matters, and there are some specific technical terms involved there, and the jargon is not always known to a to an interpreter who does a general interpretation. Even though we also have to always learn and prepare for each and every session, and we have to familiarize ourselves with the terms that are going to be used. However, it would come much more naturally to a person who is involved in it on a day-to-day basis, on a daily basis, within the department, within the institution, because that person would have so much more access to the terminology, to the issues, and understanding of the issues, of the ongoing issues. That was the first reason. Second reason, I thought that perhaps the Indonesian government would have to have official translators, interpreters within each department, would be that simply you cannot outsource everything, each and every assignment, to an outside interpreter, because there are so many confidential matters discussed. And that, I believe, well, yes, we as professional translators, interpreters are bound by our oath, which is not to disclose. Whatever is being said, we are just there to interpret it and forget about it. But at the same time, there are some really very, very sensitive issues which can only be handled from within. And it cannot be, of course, understanding the complexity of the job of an interpreter. We cannot expect a layperson, a person who is very good in both languages, a person who is technically very well prepared. The substance, he understands or she understands the substance, he understands the terms, but the skill of, we cannot expect that person to be able to also interpret, because interpretation, the act of interpreting, is so complicated. I will try to give you, and I would like to have just plug in my battery, make sure that it works. And so it requires so much more than just mastery of the language, mastery of the technical terms, mastering of the issue. So that is why I thought that perhaps it would be a good idea for the Indonesian government to develop, to recognize this position, the function of interpreters. And the third reason was because I had the opportunity to work with a very, very dear person, a very highly respected person, Mr. Dr. Andes Widodo Sutio, the former, the interpreter of, let's say, 30 years or something, to the former president, and also active later on, later on in training, on-the-job training for junior interpreters. I had the opportunity to work with him in the booth on several occasions, and I learned from him that it was so, he was the only one for so many years that the government could rely on. to interpret for the government, for the head of the state in international talks and etc. Well, having a single person do that for such a long time without any continuation is, I think, not. I thought at the time it was not a very wise thing to do. So that for those three reasons at least, I so much welcome the official recognition of you, my fellow translators, interpreters, the official recognition of your position. And that is such a huge leap forward by the Indonesian government, and such a great recognition. So, of course, the use of Indonesian language as a requirement, mandated by Law Number 24 of 2009. Then presidential regulation 16 of 2010 concerning the use of the Indonesian language in official speeches by the president and or the vice president and other state officials, and a complementing regulation, presidential regulation 63 of 2019 concerning the use of Indonesian language. All of these lay the legal basis for the use of Indonesian language in international fora organized in Indonesia, and it can also be used in forums, international forums organized overseas. But it requires to conduct official communication in the government and in the private sector in Indonesian language. So, of course, what do we mean by official speeches delivered in official forums organized by the United Nations, international organizations, and host states? I would like to pause a moment and share with you a very interesting experience that I've had when I was asked to accompany, well, it was not strictly related to the law, interpreting in the field of law or court interpretation, but nevertheless, it is a good example, I think, of how Indonesian language can be used in international fora. One of the examples is when I was asked by to interpret for the Speaker of the House of Representatives in the United Nations. And that was my first experience in the United Nations, and it was a great privilege. So the speech was delivered in Indonesian, and it was interpreted by me into English, and from English back into Indonesian. Another example, I think representative example, it was was the IPU, or the International Parliamentary Union. So this is the United Nations, involves the states, right? It is interstates, organization of states, sovereign states in the world. And the IPU is International Parliamentary Union, is an organization of parliaments all over the world. So this is one is the executive, and the other one is the legislative branch organization, international organization. And there, indeed, there was the Indonesian Speaker of the House of Representatives actually nominated himself as the president of the IPU. And in the session in Geneva, he delivered his speech in Indonesian, and I was asked to interpret it into English. And it made me feel very proud. These are some of the examples where the Indonesian language can be used and should be probably used to also promote as a national pride the Indonesian language. And of course, in international forums organized in Indonesia, reciprocally, foreign nationals can use foreign language, and organizers are required to provide translation or interpretation to Indonesian language or to and from or to a foreign language. This is another potential area where you, my dear fellow translators and interpreters, can be asked actually to play a role. And of course, it's not a matter of, oh, can I do it? Can I not do it? Well, you have to just do it. And I can assure you that there are some situations where there is a lot of if I can speak based on my personal experience, there is a lot of, let's say, hesitation, perhaps a lot of lack of confidence. Can I do it? Am I actually able to do it? Well, I could mention another example situation where I really had to just, just do it, even though didn't really feel prepared like doing it. For example, I'm sure that some of you have working pair languages, for example, Indonesian into English and English into Indonesian. Some of you may be working from Indonesian into Arabic and vice versa. Some of others of you may be working with other pairs of languages. And of course, you need to be trained because you learn by doing, you learn by developing a database, kind of a database, quote unquote, in your mind. You have an established database in your mind, terms that would come up frequently in a particular conversation or a particular setting. And it's not always possible for you to do, even though you master a certain language, it's not a guarantee, again, that you are able to do interpreting. And that's one of the situations where I speak French. I've learned French, but it's not my working language. And I particularly made a point to my client that I was not going to be able to do French interpretation, French Indonesian, because that's not my working language. So this is my professional. I felt it like my professional responsibility to inform the client about that. But as it turned out, the client actually had no other choice but to seek my assistance. And then I had to do negotiation, quote unquote negotiation, disclosing what I was able to do, I was going to be able to do, and what I was not going to be able to do, what the client could expect from me and what the client could not expect from me. And I thought it was my professional responsibility to inform the client about that. And rather than just saying, well, yes, I'm going to do it, and then nanti bagaimana nanti, I chose to say, but nanti bagaimana. So I didn't choose the attitude nanti bagaimana nanti, but nanti bagaimana. And I communicated that to the client, and we were able to actually negotiate a way that worked for the client. It worked for the audience, and the communication, which is an essential part of our job as interpreters, was actually conducted in an uninterrupted manner. So the message got through to the audience in a way that was intended by the speaker. And as a result of that, the audience was able to respond in a way that that actually made the communication flow. And my proposed solution at the time was, well, yes, I'm not used to doing interpretation from Indonesian to French and vice versa, although I have a passive knowledge of the written French language. So would somebody translate it, the speech that had to be delivered to a francophone speaking African nations, representatives of francophone African nations who spoke no English at all. So the speech was translated, and I agreed with the speaker we agreed that he would stop at a certain paragraph, and after he stopped speaking in Indonesian, I would read out the translation in French. Of course, many other obstacles came up. For example, when you are unsure, when we are a little bit hesitant, then you tend to speak at a lower tone, right? You're shy, especially when you have to do it like standing in front of your audience, not in a booth, but standing in front of your audience next to an important official and facing an important audience, representatives of countries, and then speaking a language that you are not really very used to speaking in this setting. And then one of the team members came up to me and said, "Could the interpreter speak up, please?" And then, of course, I have to deal with this psychological pressure already. And then somebody comes up to me and expresses a kind of I could take it as I don't know, maybe a critique, a reminder. And that could also contribute to further losing my self-confidence. But what I did, I reversed this whole process, and I said to myself, I'm here, I have to do this, what I have to do, and I will do it to the best of my ability. And I'm not shy about it. If I make a mistake, I'm not shy about it, but I will try to do my very best. So I spoke up, and everybody was happy. Of course, I thought that it was maybe the end of my task, but it was not. As it turned out, it was not the end, because then I was requested by the official's assistant to join the official at the table, at the dining table, because he was trying to have a conversation with one of the representatives who spoke no English at all, and the House of Representatives, the official did not speak any French at all. So I was requested to sit there and to interpret. And this time it was not scripted, right? So it was like a conversation flowing and me doing my very best, pulling out everything that I had to be able to facilitate the communication. And as it appeared, well, we were able to talk about a lot of things. They were able to talk about a lot of things with my intermediation. So this is just a story for you to understand that as interpreters, government interpreters, you might face some very interesting situations, and which can be quite intimidating for you as personally, but you have to challenge yourself all the time to do it, to take the courage and to do your very best, and to use all your knowledge and ability and everything that you have to cope and to deal with the situation. So that was about using the Indonesian language and using other languages as well. And then we come to the functional position of translators and interpreters. Thank God for that. I'm very happy and very proud to see this kind of a regulation giving you a recognition, official recognition as translators, as civil servants. This is a huge leap forward, as I mentioned earlier. And of course, SETCAB is the institution in charge of developing the functional position of translators, and interpreters. I think it's a huge responsibility, and it's a huge task ahead of the State Secretariat, because of the complexity of that involves, also because of the practice that is required for implementing this kind of a function. I have to just come back to Mr. Widodo Supilo, who was always there. I remember being asked to do the interpreting for the president's speech delivered on the 17th or 16th of August every year, the accountability speech at the House of Representatives. And of course, there are foreign diplomats present, and they require translation. And I remember Mr. Widodo sitting in the booth next to me and with junior interpreters, and they actually had the speech written, but at a certain point, they just, because of the enormity of the task, they actually kind of were not able to follow, even though they were only required to do sight translation, or perhaps it was already translated and they had the written translation. But under the enormity of the task, some of them wavered, and Mr. Widodo had to jump in at certain moments. So this makes me think that it is indeed a big, let's say, a burden for an interpreter. Especially if you do simultaneous interpreting, and especially if you do court interpreting, because remember, you are facilitating communication between the defendant, between the accused person, between the fugitive in extradition cases, for example, and the court, the panel of judges. And whatever they say, you have to interpret in a way that is complete, accurate, appropriate, and right on time, so that it facilitates the fate of the defendant may depend on the way you interpret his or her statements, even though there is a transcript, of course, in the court proceedings. But sometimes the way you deliver that in court, the way you make the panel of judges understand, does make a lot of difference. So this is now, as government interpreters, I believe you might be required to do interpreting in the court, representing your client, which is the government. your department, your particular department, or an expert witness, maybe in the position as not necessarily as defendant, maybe as a plaintiff, maybe as expert witness, maybe as factual witness. All of those situations can occur, and in which you might be required to do this interpretation. And then you will have to deal with those internal hurdles, internal challenges that I have just described to you. And this leads me to the role of interpreters in law and court interpreting, of course, which is the main topic of today. And certainly there is a lot I could say about that, having interpreted for so many law-related seminars, training seminars, negotiations, public hearings, should I say presidential lectures about anti-corruption law, about natural disaster fund accountability, for example, after the Aceh tsunami disaster, when there was an international conference organized by BPK, the state audit, or the audit board of Indonesia, with similar agencies from other parts of the world. And Indonesia was a showcase at the time of how natural disaster relief funds were managed in a transparent, accountable way. And that conference, the purpose of that conference was actually to show it to the world how Indonesia had dealt with it. And so this was certainly related to the law as well. And then, of course, court interpretation, I could also mention, I will mention some other examples of court interpreting. Before I do, let me just spend a few minutes about the technical aspect. What does it involve to act as an interpreter, to act as juru bahasa? In any setting, in any environment, in any law-related and as well as non-law related, but particularly in law-related because it is so related to our topic today, in any environment, in any situation, in any pair of languages, whatever pair of languages you are using as an interpreter. So we are talking, the process of interpretation is, source language, we listen to the source language, we use our language skills, linguistic skills, we use our substantive knowledge, and we use our technical skills to convey the message uttered in the source language. So decoding the message and encoding it and conveying it in the target language to the target audience. So this is basically the process. So we are talking about source language and we are talking about target language. And the interpreter is right in the middle between the speaker and the audience, acting as intermediary, facilitating communication. And basically what an interpreter does, so if we look at interpreting as a form of communication, as Ibu Heni mentioned, communication, that it is conveying, it's about conveying the message. So communication, as I would like to quote from a writing about interpreter behavior, a psychological approach from Ildiko Horvat, in this case, communication seen as behavior is not an object, but a process. This is an important part. The participants of this process are the sender and the receiver of the message. And I have highlighted the sender and the receiver, and I have highlighted the message. So basically, ini bukan tujuan akhir ya. Komunikasi kan bukan objek, tetapi proses. So the sender's role in this case is to encode the message, and then the receiver decodes it. And which encoding, in this case, is an internal activity in which verbal and non-verbal behaviors are selected to create a message in concordance with the contextual rules that govern the interaction and the rules of grammar and syntax applicable to the language being used. So this is a very complicated process. In other words, communication, interpreting as a communication, as process, involves encoding the message on the sender's part. In this case, is the speaker. And then it involves verbal and non-verbal behaviors, and putting it in the using the contextual rules, for example, grammar, syntax applicable, and encoding it. Now, decoding is also an internal process of the message through which meaning is attributed. And I think meaning is also an important word, which should be also highlighted. Meaning is attributed to those behaviors that represent the sender's internal state of mind. If I translate it into simple terms, decoding is understanding the message, and then in the way that was intended by the original speaker. This is very much in line with what interpreters are professionally required to do. So we have to receive the message, decode it, and then encode it in a way that is conveyed to the target audience, to the receiver, the audience, in the way without distortion. So how do we achieve it? Of course, by linguistic means, but it's not only linguistic means, we also have to understand the concepts, we have to understand the culture even. So we have to master the verbal and non-verbal elements of communication. Before I get too theoretical about it, so this was only to reflect the importance of communication, the process of communication, and the role of an interpreter as the intermediary in this process of communication, whereby the interpreter himself or herself is also communicating, involved in the communication process by decoding, encoding, encoding both ways. From the source language to the target language, from the target language, and then whatever is said in the target language, then it becomes the source language. And so we have to encode it and convey it, decode it, encode it, and convey it to the intended audience. Without, and this is important for me to underline, without adding or reducing the message, without adding our own interpretation. So it has to be the message as was intended by the original speaker. So these are the internal processing of a message, which is attributed to the internal state of mind of the speaker. Now, again, coming back to the interpretation in the field of law. Well, you can interpret a lot of on a lot of different subjects. You need to understand basically, very generally, that there is private law, there is public law, private law or civil law, and public law or criminal law, and there is international law, both private and public international law. Why do we need to understand that just in general terms? Is because the terms, the terminology used, the legal concepts that will come up necessarily in the interpretation process will have to be interpreted properly. So we need to find the equivalents in a matter of seconds if we are interpreting simultaneously, or we need to in a matter of maybe a little bit more time, but not too much more time if we are doing consecutive interpreting. And I will touch briefly on the modes of interpretation as well. And so law-related subjects can occur in any situation. You, as government interpreters, of course, work for a certain department, certain agency, certain ministry, and you you will come across law-related subjects in any area, whether you work for the Ministry of Trade, whether you work for that you have been assigned to the Ministry of Mineral Resources, whether you have been assigned to the tax authorities. In any event, you are bound to come across law-related subjects, and that could be in any kind of a setting. It could be in international seminars, it could be in bilateral or multilateral negotiations, It can be during a state visit or state event. It could be a presidential lecture. It could be a policy analysis involving foreign parties, or it could be an anti-dumping investigation. That will all have to do in one way or another with the law. Let me give you a brief example of how you might be required to interpret for related to law-related subjects. I was privileged to be one of the interpreters for simultaneous interpreters for international law and international trade law seminar conducted in 2000 in Jakarta as a cooperation between the Director General of Laws and Regulations and the Australian Attorney General's Department. And I would like to show you, just as a matter of interest, I would like to show you the report. The report of that particular seminar, which is not, I think, about 2,000 pages long. And you can, okay, I'm trying to focus in. Yeah, this is the book. This is the tangible volume. And you can imagine I was interpreting from the 10th to the 14th of April in 2000. How many days is that? 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, about 5 days in a row. And that was simultaneous interpreting. No, I did not have previous access to the materials, so I had to play it by the ear. And the other interpreter did consecutive interpretation on the stage, and so I found myself alone in the booth. And so I was doing it both ways, Indonesian, English, Indonesian, and I did that on the topics that were covered. So that just to give you an idea of the range of law-related topics that I had to handle. For example, the topics were introduction to international law. Second, law of the sea and its implementation in Indonesia and in Australia. International human rights law, law of treaties, intellectual property, private international law, WTO dispute settlement mechanism, e-commerce, and international contracts. So those there were Indonesian speakers from the Indonesian side, and there were Australian speakers from the Australian side. And you can imagine that these are from the perspective of two different legal systems. Indonesia, as you may know, may be well aware, applies still the continental law system, whereas Australia applies the common law system. And all of that had to be brought in the broader context of international law. So this is just to give you an idea of the law-related topics that one may be required to interpret for. And now you have the advantage as government interpreters to be familiar, and perhaps your assignments will not be so wide-ranging, will not be so broad. They will probably be just focused on the scope of your department. But that does not mean that you do not have to be prepared. You still need to be prepared at all times to do this kind of interpretation. Now, coming to interpreting in court or alternative dispute resolution proceedings. Why I have added alternative dispute resolution proceedings, namely arbitration, is because I can see that based on my experience, the Indonesian government in its contracts with multinational companies tends to use the arbitration clause. So the arbitration clause in these government contracts is very clear on the choice of the dispute settlement mechanism and the general terms of the arbitration proceedings that the parties agree to. And indeed, I've had the opportunity, or I've been asked by the government also to interpret in some arbitration proceedings, hearings, particularly for witnesses or factual or expert witnesses. witness statements. So this is an important role. If you are, for example, working as interpreter for let's say the Ministry of Mineral Resources, and if there is a ongoing case, you might be called upon to interpret. And this is where you have to be prepared, qualification-wise, experience-wise, and mentally, physically as well, because these assignments, mind you, might take a lot of effort, and you might have to appear in person. You might have to be required to do it online. You might be required to travel. You might be required to do the interpreting in Indonesia. You might be required to do the interpreting overseas, maybe in London, maybe in Singapore, maybe in other country, another jurisdiction, depending on the arbitration center. So this is something that I think requires attention, and I think it is important to also take into consideration arbitration, interpreting in arbitration proceedings. Well, if you talk about interpreting in court, then of course you can be required to interpret for civil cases, for criminal cases, for human rights cases, corruption cases, environmental cases, or arbitration proceedings. Each of these cases would require a certain understanding, let's see, understanding of the case, and certainly, most importantly, you have to be prepared to do the interpretation using the appropriate mode and technique for interpretation in court. Now, the modes and techniques, well, I'm sure that other lecturers will talk about this in more details, but I would still like to mention it in the context of interpreting in court. So one of the techniques that we can use is consecutive interpreting, whereby, of course, the speaker makes a speech or says a few sentences, and we, of course, are required to take notes. And then we have to reproduce what the speaker has said for the audience, in this case, the panel of judges, or perhaps vice versa to the defendant or to the defense team, etc. So basically to the court. And then, of course, in court, we normally we sit close to the speaker. The speaker in this case, in a court setting, is the defendant or the witness himself or herself, and we have to use a notepad and pen to take notes, and we have to use the microphone. So a lot of things we have to take care of in the court, and we also have to look at the protocol which applies in the court proceeding. We have to watch our mannerisms. We have to watch our tone of voice. We have to be respectful to the judges, to the courtroom, and so on and so forth. Our oath needs to be taken. So there are a lot of intricacies, or sorry, I'm sorry, wrong choice of words. There are a lot of details that we have to bear in mind in this kind of a situation. And of course, yes, please.
Ya, Ibu, ini Bu, mengingat keterbatasan waktu, mungkin Ibu masih banyak ya bahan paparannya.
Yes, yes.
Sudah masuk beberapa pertanyaan, Ibu mungkin bisa.
Yes. Ya, baik. Saya akan coba untuk to skip through the technicalities. So the consecutive interpretation, I would like to just point out the note taking, the importance of taking notes, and then of course Lisan interpreting is when it is a little bit shorter of consecutive interpretation, and simultaneous interpreting when we are using the booth, and you can also apply whispering or chuchotage, which when you whisper the translation into, for example, to the defendant, etc. And I have also in my materials, you can look at the interpreter's black box, interpreter conducting simultaneous interpretation. This is a scheme that I have developed myself. Chuchotage, which is more, you can apply that when you have to interpret for 1 to 4 people. Sight translation, which is a combination of oral and written translation, which you can, by reading the script, you can do a direct translation. And of course, I talked about understanding legal concepts and mastering legal terminology. And I wanted to give an example of a extradition case where I was actually required to interpret in a language pair that is not my working language, and of course understanding the case, the facts of the case, and managing communications with your client is important. I have touched briefly on that as well, and of course we need to understand procedural law in the national jurisdiction as well as in the international jurisdiction where we are required to do an interpretation. And of course, we need to understand that by law, justice seekers in Indonesia who do not understand Indonesian language do have access under the law, must have access to interpretation and translation. And here, of course, interpreters in general, the role of interpreters is already provided for in several legislation, in existing legislation in Indonesia. This is for general interpreters. And of course, you need to understand the Indonesian court proceedings in order to be able to position yourself properly in the court. And of course, you need to position yourself in the process of the communication process in the courtroom. And I've also, I would like to just make one important point here, namely what really makes a difference between a court interpretation and general interpretation is the protocol, is the certain code of conduct that needs to be observed by the interpreter in court. I've also offered some case studies of the Indonesian government winning some cases in the international arbitration cases. And my question would be, which is a very significant legal victory. Obviously, it does ascertain and affirm Indonesia's legal position, and it is very beneficial for Indonesia as a nation. But my question is, what is the potential role of interpreters in such cases? And that's something that we could discuss. And of course, the qualifications that you require as a sworn translator are set out in the regulation of the Minister of Law and Human Rights. And I'm sure that for government interpreters as well, there is a certain criteria of qualifications that need to be complied with. Now, the question is, how do we acquire these skills? How do we acquire these qualifications? And well, of course, I've also tried to outline the things to remember when interpreting at court and in arbitration proceedings, which I can touch upon briefly later on. But I think regardless of the qualifications, the matter of qualifications and the certification required for you to do court interpreting, I think that in general, I can say that you do have to take preparatory steps, not only in court interpreting, but particularly in court interpreting, you would normally have to prepare a glossary of frequently used terminology. You would have to have a list and also study the details and the facts of the case. Of course, you cannot use those notes in the court hearing. You only can rely on your memory and on your notes. And then you also have to comply with certain administrative requirements, such as your ID, original ID. You have to be prepared to present your original ID, minutes of oath taking if you are a sworn translator, or any other official document that authorizes you as translator or interpreter, and you have to be able to present it to the panel of the judges. Or, of course, you need to also prepare some notepad and pens for note taking. And I talked about the external obstacles. I talked about also briefly the internal obstacles that may arise in any setting, particularly in the courtroom. The courtroom, the sound system of the courtroom may not be working properly. You need to you need to be prepared to actually communicate to the presiding judge. The speaker may not be speaking clearly or articulately, or they are speaking too long, using complicated sentences or terms. The solution is for you to just address the presiding judge and ask the questions to be that challenge or obstacle to be overcome, either by asking the speaker to rephrase the question so that you can interpret properly. Internal obstacles can include maybe the contents of the message causes an internal reaction within you. Then you have to, of course, take control. You have to be aware of that, and you have to take control of those. reactions and stay focused on the main message professionally, or you inadvertently make a mistake, misinterpret something. That can happen. We are humans. If that is the case, of course, the solution is for you to realize after you realize it, or whether if you realize it yourself, if somebody points it out to you, then the best way to do it is just apologize and ask politely for the question to be or the statement to be repeated so that you are able to interpret it properly. So this is the professional attitude rather than becoming kind of discouraged. And in conclusion, I would like to say that the increasingly important role of Indonesia in the international community, interpreters in general, but also government interpreters in particular, play a significant role in the field of law and court proceedings. Their professional performance can directly contribute to the successful outcome of law-related talks, negotiations, dispute settlement, and other law-related topics and situations. And the Indonesian government's recognition of the strategic role of translators, interpreters by establishing a formal functional position under the law for them since 2014 has been a giant leap forward, but it needs to be followed up by further endeavors, particularly to ensure that such functional position can be filled with highly qualified people, and therefore continued professional development of interpreters needs to involve on-the-job as well as formal training and education. And on-the-job training is so important. Running that extra mile is so important. The jam terbang, yeah. How do you get jam terbang if you do not do it? So you really actually have to do it. My recommendation for the way forward would be to bring the profession of interpreting to the next level by introducing a formal higher education for interpreters in Indonesia in general. And perhaps I would not like to give recommendations to the State Secretariat, as it already has some very, very good programs in place. So I'm not in a position to give recommendations in that respect. My only concern is that in the meantime, while we are striving to achieve that next level in formal education for interpreters, perhaps everything begins in the mind. So it all comes back to, in addition to the training, whatever training you go through, whatever courses you attend, it all comes back to you, and everything begins in the mind, in your mind, by saying, I can do it, I can do it. No matter how challenging, no matter how impossible it sounds to you, no matter how intimidating, quote unquote, it is to you to do it, if you start out with the mindset, I can do it, then you are halfway there. And then after I have done it, so it's a kind of a fulfillment that you have been able to actually overcome the obstacles, the hurdles, and you have done it. And then I want to do it again, because I do want to serve and represent my country to the best of my ability as an interpreter, as a government interpreter. And I can say, actually, I was intending to put it in the title of my talk, Juru Bahasa Duta Bangsa. You are the window, the bridge. You are also representing your country. The way you act, the way you react, the way you speak, the way you talk, the way you behave, the way you facilitate communication in a professional manner is representing Indonesia as a great nation. Pangsa menunjukkan bangsa. The interpreter, jurubahasa, adalah duta bangsa. So with that, I would like to conclude my speech, my talk, and I very much welcome any questions from the floor. So, Mr. Moderator, I would like to render the floor back to you.
Baik, terima kasih Ibu Mariana. Ya, memang 2 jam tidak akan cukup Ibu ya untuk menyampaikan paparan yang begitu komprehensif dan panjang ini.
2 hari pun tidak.
Tidak akan cukup untuk banyak Ibu yang sudah Ibu sampaikan. Bu, ini sudah banyak pertanyaan yang masuk. Mungkin kami awali dengan yang raise hand dulu, Bu ya. Pertanyaan dari silakan Ibu Dewi untuk mengaktifkan speakernya. Silakan untuk langsung bertanya ke Ibu Mariana. Silakan Ibu Dewi.
Baik, terima kasih Pak Tarmuji. Selamat siang Ibu Mariana.
Selamat siang.
Saya ingin bertanya spesifik untuk bidang hukum. Karena background saya sendiri itu sarjana sastra Inggris. Jadi untuk bidang penerjemahan ya umum saja, tidak terlalu spesifik gitu. Dari materi yang tadi Ibu paparkan sangat spesifik, banyak sekali di bidang hukum. Nah, pertanyaan saya, untuk menjadi seorang interpreter di bidang hukum atau penerjemah di bidang hukum, apakah belajar mandiri atau mengikuti kursus atau short courses itu cukup atau tidak untuk itu, atau apakah sebaiknya kalau mau pursue di bidang legal interpretation atau legal translation butuh juga untuk kita kuliah lagi di bidang hukum gitu. Jadi itu bagaimana tanggapan Ibu? Karena saya lihat sendiri Ibu 12 tahun pengalaman di bidang hukum dengan degree yang sampai doktor. Nah itu menurut Ibu apakah worth it gitu kalau kita kuliah lagi nih, kuliah hukum lagi gitu. Mungkin itu saja Ibu, terima kasih.
Bapak, terima kasih Ibu Dewi. Pak moderator, boleh saya langsung menanggapi secara singkat? Ya, Bu Dewi, terima kasih. Ibu dari Lemhanas ya? Ya, dan
Saya
Lemhanas.
dari Dispar Kabupaten Bima, Ibu.
Dari Kabupaten mana?
Dari Kabupaten Bima, NTB.
Oh, sorry. Oh, ya. Oh, Dispar ya. Dispar berarti Dinas Pariwisata. Oh, very good. Ibu Dewi, iya Bu. Bu, ya, terima kasih banyak. Pertanyaan sangat menarik. Apakah belajar sendiri atau bagaimana untuk menjadi penerjemah di bidang hukum? Saya bisa berbagi pengalaman pribadi saya, Bu. Saya diambil sumpahnya sebagai penerjemah tersumpah di bidang hukum itu pada tahun 1995. Ketika saya belum sarjana hukum, saya belum magister hukum, saya belum menjadi doktor ilmu hukum. Jadi benar-benar learning by doing, karena saya memang juga seperti Ibu dari sastra dan bahasa Inggris dan Prancis. Kemudian saya mengembangkan diri, saya menerjemahkan learning by doing. Kemudian kebetulan saya sedikit banyak menerjemahkan untuk sebuah proyek pembaharuan Hukum Dagang Indonesia, bekerja sama dengan USAID, dan kemudian di situ saya berkesempatan sekali untuk menerjemahkan berbagai topik mengenai hukum. Dari berbagai bidang hukum, seperti yang saya sampaikan, hukum saja, tidak, kalau kita sarjana hukum, bukan berarti kita ahli hukum di semua bidang hukum, tidak. Saya juga tidak berpretensi saya ahli di semua bidang hukum, meskipun saya sekarang sudah doktor hukum, ilmu hukum. Nah, pertanyaan Ibu, saya ya learning by doing is the best way. Menurut saya itu paling bagus, meskipun kita memang harus punya dasar linguistik ya, pengetahuan bahasa seperti yang Ibu lakukan. Jadi Ibu katanya belajar jadi sastra Inggris bidang penerjemahan ya Bu ya. Itu boleh saya tahu dari universitas mana, perguruan tinggi mana?
Saya dari UIN Malang, Ibu.
Malang, ya. Oke, berarti
Malang.
ya bagus sekali kalau memang setahu saya FIB juga pernah menyelenggarakan apakah sekarang masih atau tidak, saya belum tidak terlalu mengikuti akhir-akhir ini. Tapi pada saat itu memang ada program spesialisasi penerjemah yang disetarakan dengan S2 waktu itu di UI. Jadi memang ada usaha selama ini setahu saya untuk memformalkan ya pendidikan untuk penerjemah. Tetapi saya belum melihat, mungkin saya kalau ada mungkin ada, tetapi saya belum melihat adanya satu pendidikan di mungkin di tingkat S2 seperti yang seperti ada di luar negeri ya, misalnya di Swiss atau di negara-negara lain yang sudah dilakukan yang kalau kita belajar khusus untuk conference interpreter gitu, misalnya seperti itu. Nah, kalau menjawab pertanyaan Ibu, apakah sebaiknya kalau untuk melakukan penerjemahan di bidang hukum, apakah saya harus menjadi sarjana hukum atau tidak? Jawaban saya adalah mungkin Ibu bisa menyimpulkan sendiri dari 1995 sampai dengan sekarang saya melakukan penerjemahan di bidang hukum. Saya juga menjadi sworn translator setelah saya jadi saya ujian ujian yang diselenggarakan oleh UI bekerja sama dengan pemerintah daerah DKI Jakarta, dan di situ kalau kita tidak mendapatkan A, terjemahan bahasa Inggris ke Indonesia dan sebaliknya, maka tidak diambil sumpahnya. Saya waktu itu kebetulan lulus terjemahan tertulis, tetapi bukan untuk juru bahasa. Jadi sebetulnya saya baru mulai belajar hukum 2007. Berarti Ibu bisa menghitung dari 1996 sampai 2007, saya itu sama sekali tidak punya legal background, tapi saya menerjemahkan di berbagai-bagai seminar, kemudian juga pertemuan internasional dan sebagainya mengenai hukum. Alhasil saya berpikir, saya sudah menerjemahkan mengenai hukum, mengenai berbagai bidang hukum itu, apa lebih baik saya formalkan saja pengetahuan saya. Ya udah sekalian saya belajar aja hukum gitu. Jadi ya udah sambil bekerja, anak-anak saya sudah baru masuk kuliah waktu itu, saya jadi saya daftar di Universitas Al-Azhar Indonesia. Alhasil dengan saya bekerja sambil saya juga mengurus rumah tangga dan lain sebagainya, sering sekali keluar negeri mendapatkan tugas interpreting. Saya menyelesaikan full time, bukan yang Sabtu Minggu itu, bukan full studies dalam jangka waktu 3,5 tahun dengan IPK 4,0. Ya, artinya tidak perlu, ya saya senang karena apa? Karena saya sudah sedikit banyak mengetahui mengenai hukum dengan menerjemahkan. Jadi kalau Anda sebagai penerjemah itu menurut saya itu satu kesempatan yang luar biasa ya untuk belajar mengenai berbagai bidang, bukan hanya bidang hukum, mengenai hal-hal yang psikologi, mengenai politik dan lain sebagainya. Anda sambil melakukan pekerjaan, sambil belajar. Karena untuk setiap kali melaksanakan tugas, kita harus belajar seolah-olah kita ujian kompre. Saya tuh betul-betul setiap kali sebelum melaksanakan tugas itu sepertinya mau ujian kompre. Jadi benar-benar all around ya. Itu ternyata dalam kenyataannya bisa terjadi situasi misalnya duta besar dari semua negara anggota Uni Eropa di Jakarta bertemu dengan pimpinan ya masyarakat keagamaan misalnya NU atau dengan katakanlah dengan Muhammadiyah. Itu kan mereka kan yang muncul kan pasti ada juga yang berkaitan dengan hukum, dan lebih pasti akan muncul topik-topik yang berkaitan dengan mungkin hukum yang bukan hak hukum nasional, tapi juga dengan misalnya hukum Islam barangkali ya. Itu harus di situ saya merasa saya diuntungkan Bu ya. Saya pernah belajar jadi mahasiswi udah tua di UAI, Universitas Al-Azhar Indonesia. Saya belajar mengenai namanya ekonomi syariah, saya belajar mengenai zakat baitul mal, saya belajar mengenai asuransi syariah dan lain sebagainya. Saya sangat merasa beruntung karena saya tidak bingung gitu dalam situasi itu. Jadi maksud saya, pengembangan apapun silakan. Kalau Anda tertarik dengan bidang hukum, silakan Anda belajar. Tidak ada kata untung atau tidak untung. Semua ilmu itu pasti ada untungnya, pasti ada manfaatnya. Tergantung kita memanfaatkannya bagaimana. Itu Bu yang bisa saya sampaikan. Panjang ya. Oke, jawabannya mungkin yang lain silakan.
Ya.
Next.
Terima kasih Bu.
Terima kasih Bu Dewi. Sukses ya. Semangat ya.
Terima kasih.
Belajar dan jam terbang ya. Kemudian
ya.
Belajar dan jam terbang Bu ya. Bayangkan.
Oh iya.
Mulai penerjemahan hukum. Kemudian ini di kolom chat ada 6 pertanyaan Ibu. Cuman ini yang langsung dulu yang mungkin ya dari, kemudian selanjutnya ini ada Mbak Arienda mungkin ya dulu ya. Mbak Arienda silakan.
Ya, terima kasih.
Padat jelas Mbak ya, karena masih banyak pertanyaan ini di kolom chat ada 6, yang resen juga masih banyak ini. Silakan Mbak Arienda.
Ya, baik Bu, terima kasih atas presentasinya komprehensif. Pertanyaan saya cukup teknis Bu, mohon maaf karena ini kegiatan yang baru bagi saya ya. Jadi tadi Ibu menyatakan tentang do and don'ts gitu ya, rekomendasi termasuk protokol ketika menghadapi interpreting dalam berbagai forum seperti itu. Pertanyaan saya adalah kira-kira nih like who should you consult with like regarding this kind of protocols to know like the do and don'ts when it comes to interpreting on the ground. Thank you very much.
Oh, bagus sekali. Terima kasih Bu Arienda dari Lemhanas ya Bu. Ya, do and don'ts itu sangat tergantung dari arena yang Anda masuki. Sebelum kita memasuki sebuah arena, quote unquote arena, tentu kita harus mengetahui sebanyak-banyaknya. Misalnya selain kita mengetahui mengenai kasusnya, details of the case, kita juga harus tahu bagaimana aturan yang berlaku di situ. Kalau Anda masuk misalnya di pengadilan, ya tentu saja ada protokol ya di situ yang berlaku, dan seharusnya memang atasan Anda yang menugaskan Anda, tentu saja Anda bisa bertanya kepada dia, dan kalau dia tidak tahu maka dia bisa mencari tahu. Itu pertama. Kalau Anda misalnya memasuki sebuah misalnya bilateral talks ya, satu perundingan bilateral. Nah, di situ juga learning by doing, observing. Jadi tentu Anda juga akan dikasih tahu oleh protokol. Anda juga bisa bertanya secara proaktif oleh protokol, tapi jangan kaget kalau Anda tidak terlalu, maksudnya kalau Anda tidak terlalu bisa banyak bertanya karena mereka sangat sibuk ya, karena kan ada VIP di situ. Jadi di situ ya Anda by observing the situation. Tentu ini tidak jauh dari maksudnya kesopanan santunan pada umumnya, tetapi ketika kita menerjemahkan tentu kita harus tahu. Kalau kita mengerti posisi kita sebagai penerjemah, maka kita bisa menempatkan diri. Misalnya terjadi gitu bahwa dalam bilateral talks ya misalnya di situ dikatakan bahwa oh ini tidak perlu diterjemahkan. Ya, jadi kita tidak menerjemahkan, tapi bisa saja tiba-tiba kita tidak mencatat tidak hujan, tidak angin, tidak hujan, tiba-tiba terjemahkan sekarang. Waduh. So, observing, being prepared, and just being alert all the time. Dan kalau sedapat mungkin kita mendapatkan informasi terlebih dahulu dari klien kita. Klien kita kita mendapatkan mungkin melalui atasan kita ya, Ibu Arienda. Kira-kira itu saja yang bisa saya sampaikan secara singkat.
Baik, terima kasih Ibu. Lanjut saja.
Apakah menjawab pertanyaannya Bu Arienda? Mudah-mudahan.
Ya, Bu Arienda. Ya. Kita lanjut
Terima
Ibu
kasih.
ya dengan pertanyaan
Ya,
berikutnya.
silakan.
Pak Didin dari BNPT. Langsung aja silakan Pak Didin.
Ya, baik. Terima kasih Pak Moderator sama Ibu. Saya ingin bertanya tentang pengalaman sebagai juru bahasa pengalamannya di level internasional. Apakah ada pengalaman yang mengancam terhadap keselamatan? Saya pernah nonton film yang menerjemahkan sesuatu pemerintah yang mungkin karena message-nya itu sangat rahasia, setelah penerjemahan selesai, itu si penerjemahnya dibunuh. Nah, apakah ada pengalaman yang mendekati seperti itu atau mungkin bagaimana ceritanya? Terima kasih, Ibu.
Saya bersyukur. Terima kasih atas pertanyaan Pak Didin ya, sangat menarik. Wow, saya tidak syukur ya, saya tidak pernah mengalami situasi seperti itu, dan saya selalu aman-aman saja, merasa aman-aman saja dimanapun kita berada. Tentu kita selalu menyerahkan diri, kita melakukan tugas demi bangsa dan negara. Kita juga sangat memegang teguh kerahasiaan, confidentiality. Jadi saya punya kecenderungan kalau sudah selesai satu terjemahan untuk di tingkat manapun, saya lupakan saja. Jadi makanya saya kalau bikin CV agak susah ya, saya ingat-ingat lagi karena memang itu adalah bagian dari kerahasiaan ataupun confidentiality yang saya jaga. Situasi yang mengancam saya tidak pernah rasakan itu sama sekali. Saya selalu merasa bahwa posisi saya sebagai penerjemah itu dihargai, dan saya juga mencoba untuk membawa diri sedemikian rupa sehingga dihargai, dan juga saya tidak segan-segan untuk menyampaikan, mengkomunikasikan jika saya punya kendala atau saya punya masukan, dan itu pada umumnya, dan saya terlepas dari tingkat jabatan dan lain sebagainya, saya mencoba menempatkan diri sebagai profesional. Jadi antara dua pihak itu, jadi saya menyampaikan ya komunikasi ya, supaya komunikasi kalau terjadi mungkin kalau terancam tidak, tetapi secara internally ya saya merasa tertekan gitu ya. Itu ketika saya pernah membantu dalam investigasi, maksudnya dalam pemeriksaan polisi ya terhadap terdakwa yang itu sebuah kasus besar waktu itu yang dituduh dan akhirnya divonis mencabuli anak TK gitu ya. Nah, itu saya kebetulan menerjemahkan ya ketika dalam police interview itu, dan saya ada di situ ketika dia ditahan gitu ya, dia itu, dan kemudian dibawa ke dalam tahanan gitu. Nah, itu secara internal bagi saya satu hal yang harus saya proses gitu ya sedikit. Tetapi kalau secara dan di situ ketika ketika dia dimasukkan di dalam ruang tahanan, saya keluar. Saya tidak mau masuk ke dalam. Saya kalau memang dibutuhkan, saya ada di luar. Saya tidak mau masuk ke dalam gitu. Jadi ya saya punya hak ya untuk itu, dan saya tetap berada di luar, tetapi saya tidak mau masuk sampai dikunci dari dalam. Saya tidak mau gitu ya, seperti itu Pak. Ya, jadi mungkin menjawab pertanyaan Bapak ya. Ini sih maaf tidak bisa memberikan satu gambaran yang sangat adventurous ya, tapi itu kenyataan yang maksudnya keadaan yang saya alami gitu. Ya Pak Didin, mudah-mudahan aman-aman
Ya,
aja kok.
terima kasih. Ya.
Baik, terima kasih. Apa Pak Didin pernah mendapat ancaman, Pak Didin?
Saya melihat di film, Pak.
Ya,
Takutnya kejadian.
ya, semuanya baik-baik saja ke depan. Baik, selanjutnya sebelum kita membaca pertanyaan di kolom chat, ada satu lagi yang masih resen ini, Ibu Amanda. Silakan Ibu Amanda Puspitasari.
Baik, terima kasih. I'm Amanda Puspitasari from Ministry of Women Empowerment and Child Protection or
Suaranya bisa diperbesar, Mbak Amanda, tidak terdengar.
Halo, can you hear me? Ya, Pak, bisa dengar?
Ya, ya.
Okay. Thank you so much, Ibu, for the comprehensive presentation and sharing invaluable your experiences. I just want to ask that in our occasion or task that I have been repeatedly asked to be the interpreter in the bilateral settings, which means that there is a ministry, the interministerial meeting, and there is a presentation. But our ministry has said differently from the slide or the presentation. It is very conflicting. You just said earlier that the interpreters is not only the parrot, right? Should we ask our client or our source to clarify the meaning of the sentences before we convey or we interpret to the other client, Ibu? Thank you
Terima
very
kasih
much.
Bu Amanda. Yeah, thank you so much for the question. Very interesting question. Yeah, I definitely think that you should have the opportunity. The interpreter, you as an interpreter, should have the opportunity to ask for clarification. To ask for example, if the speaker speaks too fast, or if the speaker speaks for too long, which makes it impossible for you to understand, to process, to do decode and encode and decode and encode, then you definitely have the right to say in a polite manner, to draw the attention of the moderator, for example, to either slow down or to perhaps repeat the question. But I would like to advise you not to do it too often. So we still have to be very focused, 100% focused on what is being said. And if you say that the presentation that was shown on the screen, and then you had to and the speaker said something else, right? So you were not able to actually rely totally on the presentation slides. That's what I said when I mentioned about site translation, right? So in other words, even though you have it on the screen, you cannot rely, you as an interpreter has the task to interpret exactly what is being said on the floor by the speaker. And well, the slides may be there. You might be assisted by the slides because at least you know you have a general idea what is going to be discussed, but you still have to focus on the speaker and what the speaker says. That's a professional must. And even when there are speeches, pre-scripted speeches, sometimes the speaker will digress. And in that case, this is the test for the interpreter. The interpreter must follow the speaker. And we are not parrots. When I said we are not parrots, I meant to say that we are translating not only words, word by word. We are not doing a word by word interpretation. We are conveying the meaning, the message And your audience, you will know from the audience, by the reaction of your audience, if they are able to, you can see that even if you are in a booth or if you are on the stage, you will see from the expression of your audience whether or not you are successful in doing your job, namely in conveying the message. And if you are successful, then the response will be nyambung ya. Jadi akan nyambung, pembicaranya akan nyambung. Kalau pembicaraan tidak nyambung, kemudian berarti something was lost in the translation, and that you need to be aware of. And you definitely, yes, please go ahead, especially when the speaker speaks too fast. I can just share you the experience of some United Nations interpreters, simultaneous interpreters. If you go there, you have all the booths and with all the languages, the relay system, etc. And you know what they do? They have a button. Maybe you have had the experience of working in a booth. The interpreter's console, you have a button which says cough. If you have to cough, then you have to press it. Or you have the button speak slowly, which goes directly, the signal goes to the speaker to slow them down, because sometimes in the heat of the discussion, they forget about it. And they just tend to, just go on and on and on. And some of the interpreters told me that when they started to talk too fast and they kept on pressing the speak slowly button, the interpreters actually stood up and left the booth. So I don't advise you to do that, of course, but that is, I mean, I would like to give you a kind of an illustration of what you can do. Actually, you have rights as interpreter as well. Yeah, but of course you are bound by the government, by your function and position also as a civil servant. So, but if you can communicate it to your superiors, and you can also educate them about how to use interpreters. Not all people know how to use interpreters. So sometimes you have to train the interpreters, but you also have to train your audience as well. You have to educate your audience as well. Yes, please. Next. Question, perhaps, Mr. Moderator. I hope I have been successful in answering this question.
Halo Ibu, kita mungkin baca pertanyaan di kolom chat Bu ya.
Yes, please.
Jadi Bapak Olsi Dani nih, izin tanya Bu Mariana. As well now, when we are translating legal documents, we cannot eliminate words since it will obstruct the meaning in the verses. What about when interpreting in the law-related situation? Are we still allowed to eliminate some words as long as the meaning and the message are conveyed and delivered? Itu aja Bu pertanyaannya Bu.
Okay, so I would like to first of all thank you very much for the question coming from Paolsi, yes. Yeah, I would like to just clarify whether you are referring to legal documents or interpretation. Well, I could deliver a special lecture on written translation of legal documents, which I've already done. So you are translating between legal systems, as I mentioned. But if you are interpreting legal in a law-related subjects, it will depend. If you, of course, you have to. That's why you have to understand you have to prepare. You have to understand the legal concepts. You have to understand the terminology used. You have to understand the subject in general terms. And again, you are not interpreting words. You are actually conveying the message, and you are conveying the message by using linguistic means, which means words, using the correct terms, using the structure of the language, being aware of the legal concepts, etc. So this is your professional responsibility to make sure that the message gets through, and that the message gets through quickly, that it gets through appropriately, accurately, that it gets through clearly, and that it conveys the message the way it was intended by the speaker. So you have to minimize your own interpretation. Yes, you have to decode the message, and then yes, you have to encode the message in the target language. But in doing that, you have to eliminate your own interpretation. You have to be focused on the main message. Are there going to be distortions in the translation, in the interpretation? Definitely, there will be distortions. But if you are aware of the legal concepts, then those distortions will not reduce the meaning, will not reduce the meaning of the content of the message. And that's what I would like you to concentrate on. You are translating not words. So even if you miss a word, even if you don't remember a word exactly, but if you are aware of the concept, if you are aware of the context, you will be able to convey the message the way it was intended by the original speaker. So, and then in the meantime, of course, you will have to go on and on and on in your mind. You have to go on and try to remember the correct word, or maybe it will come up, in the proceeding itself, and then you will be able to use that. You will have to correct your, to complement, not correct, to complement, to fill in the gap. But at the end of the day, your professional responsibility and the successful implementation of your job will be, did the audience receive the message in the way it was intended by the original speaker? That would be my answer to you, Pa Olsi.
Gimana Pak Ozi? Cukup?
Insya Allah cukup, Pak. Terima kasih. Thank you,
Amin.
Bu Mariana.
You're welcome.
Bagaimana Bu? Lanjut aja Ibu ya pertanyaannya. Kalau chat masih ada lagi. Kemudian dari Ibu Ika di CKI. Ya, pertanyaannya, when we are translating the words from A addressed to C, but then B, A's partner said subtly to the interpreter not to convey the information because it is classified. What should the interpreter do?
Wow, thank you so much Ibu Ika dari DJKI ya. Mungkin kita pernah ketemu ya. I'm also member of the tim ahli dikasih geografis Ibu Ika. Hi, salam DJKI. Yeah. So, very interesting question Ibu Ika. So this is about your professional. So you, first of all, you are an interpreter for the government. So you are bound by professional obligation, but you are also bound by your, your employer. So if I were to answer your question, an interpreter principally has to interpret everything the way it is said by the speaker. But if it is not, if for some reason it is not intended for public use, or if it is confidential, and if you receive that kind of an instruction from your superior, for example, then I would say, yeah, it's a dilemmatic position to be in. But I would say, well, if it is confidential, it is confidential, especially if it is for the government. So you have to respect that. I would say if, for example, I would like to make a comparison. For example, if a priest is under oath that he should not disclose the confession of, of a person who confides in him, Catholic priest, and then that person commits murder, does that priest have to kind of break his own obligation under oath to actually to save lives? So this is that kind of a, maybe not that serious a comparison, maybe not a good comparison, but if I were you, I think in your position, if that was the position, I would certainly follow well, not the instruction, but the instruction, yes, not to interpret because that is confidential. Because I, as an interpreter, do not have the ability to distinguish between what is confidential, what is not. But my superior does have that authority and does have that ability. And when I am alerted by my superior not to interpret a particular part, then I have to, I would say, I would choose not to interpret it. Yeah, if it is confidential. So that would be my answer to Ibu Ika. Hopefully, the speaker, before he or she speaks, is aware of what is confidential and what is not confidential, and they are able to just include in their speech parts which are not confidential, which are not sensitive information. That would be actually the responsibility of the speaker. But if in certain emergency situations, if you are alerted to that fact, then certainly by an authorized person, you certainly would have to follow that guidance. That would be my answer, Ibu Ika.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Ya, selanjutnya ini langsung saja mungkin Ibu Novieta bisa tanya langsung ya, Bu Novieta ya. Walaupun sudah menulis di chat, lebih baik enak langsung saja biar lebih jelas. Silakan Bu Novieta.
Hai, halo. Apakah terdengar jelas?
Jelas,
Ya,
silakan.
terdengar dan terlihat dengan jelas.
Okay,
Silakan Ibu
hi
Novieta.
Bu Mariana, thank you for the comprehensive material and also for sharing some encouraging words to us junior interpreters. Actually, I would like to ask, could we as interpreters show some emotions during our task? If there is a funny or fun talks or conversation, could we actually show some laughing, or we could smile, or if there is a sensitive topic or if there is a touching topic, could we show some anger, or could we shed some tears, or do we always have to look reserved during our task? Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much, Ibu Henrietta, right?
Novi, yeah.
Ibu Novieta Sinaga. Well, from NPR, from the People's Consultative Assembly. Yes. Yeah. I had the opportunity to work with Edi Siregar some time ago. Yes, my regards and respect to him if he's still actively engaged at NPR. Actually, I was asked to translate the Indonesian 1945 Constitution of the State of the Republic of Indonesia. So I had the opportunity to work with him and his team back in 2007. And also I was able to interpret for Cerdas Cermat Undang-Undang Dasar 45 Konstitusi. That was very interesting job to me, because ada Cerdas Cermat ya untuk kalau tidak salah SMP SMA di MPR dan diadakan dan saya menerjemahkan ke dalam bahasa Inggris secara simultan. Jadi that was an interesting task. Thank you very much, Ibu Novieta, for your question about showing emotions, or as opposed to showing emotions, staying reserved. Based on my experience, smiling is always a good thing to do. So smiling is always raises confidence. Well, of course, it's not like smiling all the time, but taking a positive, optimistic attitude is always a good thing. Even in it can also help kind of ease tensions between the parties, especially in a court interpretation setting. Well, you of course, cannot smile. You have to be reserved, but once in a while, you can actually just relax your own facial muscles by, well, giving a kind of a smile, and it all helps you relax, but it also helps other people around you relax. So it is a good thing to do. Shedding a tear, well, certainly empathizing. Yeah, we are human beings. As interpreters, we are human beings after all. We try to be professional, and ideally we should be, detached from any feeling. We have to do our job professionally, as I mentioned in the case of a police investigation, or even in a court hearing at KPK, the anti-corruption court, when I was there to interpret when and it was virtually broadcast, the proceeding was virtually or live streamed. When the verdict was pronounced, and one of the employees of the multinational companies got actually imprisoned for 6 years. He was actually convicted, and looking in the courtroom, looking around you and seeing the families cry, of course it will it will evoke some kind of emotion in you. Or in other situations, you might be in a position where you cannot withhold your tears, you cannot hold back your tears, but of course we have to try to control our emotions. We have to try to stay focused by staying focused on the main task. Your main task there is to speak, to communicate. Remember that? So we need to be focused, stay focused on the main message, on the purpose of that particular interpreting job. And so getting angry is not an option for sure. So happiness or kindness or sadness is something that could transpire in a controlled way, but anger is certainly something that needs to be controlled for sure, even though there is perhaps you feel embarrassed or you are personally attacked. I think you still need to keep your composure, and that is part of your professional performance as an interpreter. And that is, well, of course, I had certain situations where the speaker, actually the parties negotiating or the parties involved in the conversation at the bilateral level, one of the parties representing one of the big countries actually was kind of very angry at the high-ranking official Indonesian high-ranking official that I was accompanying, and it was a rather kind of embarrassing situation. The interpreter was doing his best to kind of act as a buffer, but we could not help watching the expression of the person speaking, also a high-ranking official from a foreign country. So yeah, indeed, as interpreters, I was looking at the interpreter doing his job, and he was acting very professional, detached of emotion. He was able to convey the message without putting or adding the emotional content to that. And as a result, the Indonesian high-ranking official was also able to respond in a detached manner, in a professional manner, which was, of course, interpreted by me in a detached and professional manner as well. And so, it calmed down a little bit. It calmed the situation down a little bit. So that would be my response to you, Ibu Sinaga.
Terima kasih Ibu dan teman-teman sekalian. Sebenarnya ini waktu sudah habis, sudah lewat, cuman masih banyak pertanyaan. Ini mungkin 10 menit lagi ya, Ibu ya. Izin.
Silakan, ya, dengan segala senang hati. Silakan, Pak.
Serta juga menuliskan chat, mungkin saya akan lebih memberikan kesempatan bertanya langsung ya. Mas Aditya Pratama, silakan langsung saja. Singkat saja Mas, waktunya sampai 10 menit lagi, silakan Mas.
Ya, baik, terima kasih untuk kesempatannya. Izin Ibu Mariana, apa bisa mendengar suara saya?
Oh, dengan sangat baik Pak Aditya Pratama ya. Dari instansi mana Pak?
Saya dari Sekjen MPR RI Bu, berdua dengan Mbak Novieta yang barusan.
Iya, baik.
Iya.
Ya,
dari
salam.
instansi yang sama.
Iya.
Ya Bu. Terima kasih untuk kesempatannya. Pertanyaan saya adalah, according to your experience, ma'am, could you please tell us one moment when you made a mistake in the interpreting session and how you solved the situation? Thank you.
It's hard to. I thank you for the question, Pak Aditya Pratama. Yeah, it's easier to remember successful moments, right, than failure. Yeah, it's interesting. It's an interesting question. How do you define failure? Because if you define failure, do you define it as misinterpretation or misunderstanding caused by by something that I did not interpret properly? If you define it that way, I do not really recall any situation like that.
Actually, I'm asking about a mistake, not a failure, ma'am. So maybe
failure.
You misinterpret one or two words. I mean, the speaker actually wanted to say A, but you misinterpreted the word into B or C.
Yes, I'm sure there were many mistakes like that. But the reason I do not remember them specifically, Pa Aditya Pratama, is because I try to correct it on the spot. So I do not let the mistake last for long. So it's always like, if I realize that I made a mistake, or maybe I misunderstood, I directly immediately intervene and immediately ask for clarification or immediately ask for an opportunity to clarify. So I'm sure there were dozens situations where I missed the word, or I missed the question, or perhaps the speaker went on for too long, so I was not able to interpret everything. I'm definitely sure, or that I made a mistake. Definitely. I don't want to pretend. It's just I don't remember exactly, because I prefer to clarify and rectify on the spot, and so I just forget about it. Yeah, and I always strive to do perfectly well, which is of course impossible, because as human beings, we are bound to make mistakes all the time. And we have to, but it's not about what mistake I made, but how I corrected it. And the way I always try to correct my mistakes is on the spot, being open about it, and being courageous, taking the courage to admit, yes, I was wrong. Could you please repeat it so that I can interpret it properly? And then I do. So, Aditya Pratama, I wish I could give you a very embarrassing mistake that I made, but you see, I tend to forget those mistakes because I correct them on the spot. Even there were situations where I was alerted by the one of the parties. Well, you didn't you missed this one, yeah. And then I admit, yes, I did. So could you please repeat so that I can repeat it, the interpretation, the translation in more properly, and then I do, and it always does the job. So that is a way to do that. Yes, and now I recall that on an occasion, it was a presidential speech in Bali. I think there was an international conference, and it was at the time, I think sometime after the Bali bombings, and I was so I was interpreting. I think even I was in the booth with Mr. Widodo Soteo, if I recall it correctly. And at the end, and of course there was so much security, the security there checking the booth, etc. I was in a very very special frame of mind. And then at the end of the speech, something was said about. A word was used which was kind of similar to the word bomb, and then somehow it blurted out bomb, and then I said no, not bomb, but I meant this word. But I forget the exact word what I translated, because I was so under pressure at the time, and I think that was one of the situations which totally inadvertently, but corrected the mistake altogether. And there was another speech whereby I think it was perayaan Hari Natal, Natal Nasional Bersama, in Jakarta Convention Center, and the presidential speech was there, of course, and then there was cultural performances, for example, and there was a performance from Central Java, and they were using the Javanese word montor, and I misheard it. I thought it was monster. So of course I was not aware of that it is in Javanese. Montor means, I think, motor. Yeah, is that correct? Yeah, yeah. And I interpreted it as monster. Monster. I thought it was monster, and then it was a children's play, or I don't know, a song, yeah. And then montor, montor, la la la. It was a song, I think, and then I said I interpreted it as monster. So that was maybe a funny mistake, hopefully not a fatal mistake, Aditya Pratama. So, but that is another example that we as interpreters, we have to be aware of we have to have so much general knowledge. We have to understand the culture. We have to, have a knowledge of a little bit of culture, about other languages, even the local languages. And so, yeah, that's quite interesting. And also when I had to do in court interpreting in Riau, for example, even though we are speaking, all of us are speaking Indonesian language, but there is a certain, accent, that is used there, Indonesian language, but with a certain accent. And it is, it's a challenge in its own for me to be able to understand what is being said, to understand it correctly, and to interpret it correctly as well. So this is, this is how we learn, Pa Aditya Pratama, by making mistakes and, more importantly, correcting them. I think that's an important message here. So we have to, as interpreters, we have to jatuh-jatuh bangun ya. Bukan masalah kita tidak akan jatuh. Kita pasti akan jatuh pada satu ketika. Tapi yang penting adalah bagaimana kita bangun dan kita tetap lari ya, seperti atlet-atlet yang Olimpiade yang mungkin pernah jatuh tapi dia meskipun bukan juara tapi dia tetap menyelesaikan kompetisinya, menyelesaikan lombanya. Dan tentu itu akan disambut dengan applause. What is your applause when the appreciation of your client, of your boss, the successful completion of negotiations or a seminar or a conference, that will be your ultimate success.
Baik, terima kasih Ibu. Mungkin poinnya sudah dapat ya Mas Aditya ya.
Ya, sudah Pak. Terima kasih Bu
Baik.
untuk penjelasannya.
Dari peserta
berbagi
masih ada
pengalaman.
satu pertanyaan ini Ibu. Mungkin waktunya juga sudah. Karena 1:30 harus masuk lagi Bu, masuk kelas lagi. Jadi ini satu pertanyaan terakhir mungkin dari peserta. Mbak Windy, silakan langsung saja Mbak Windy dipertanyakan. Halo Mbak Windy. Ibu Windy, silakan kalau ada pertanyaan langsung saja.
Yes, I'm sorry. Actually, my question is pretty similar with the first one. I would like to ask if we were given a text for our interpretation duty, do we have to study it by ourselves, or we can ask around people who understand the topic? That's all. Thank you.
Oh, Ibu Windy, which department do you come from? Kemendag, ya?
Yeah, Kemendagri.
Kemendagri, Kementerian Perdagangan, ya? So from the trade.
No, Kementerian Dalam Negeri.
Dalam Negeri, sorry, I'm sorry. Yeah, the internal, the Home Affairs Office. Yeah, indeed. So if you will know what your assignment will be. Ideally, in advance. So if you know in advance, that is an advantage for you. If you know in advance and you get materials, hopefully preparatory materials. Yes, you have to study them. If you get those materials, you need to study them and you need to read through them. Perhaps even underline the words, the terms that you think will be helpful for you in doing your interpreting. You can prepare a list of the important terms, a glossary. I refer it as a glossary, and that is a very interesting. So it's a glossary from Indonesian into English and from English into Indonesian. So that is step number one. Step number two, if you need to, then you can also do research on your own about the topic to see perhaps in the international context what jargon or what particular terms are being used for a similar kind of text. So definitely your first material, your first stop would be studying the materials that you receive from your boss or from your client, looking at it, reading through it, maybe even twice or 3 times, and perhaps even try simulating your interpretation. So by sight translation, reading the text and interpreting it into the target language. If it is in Indonesian, then interpreting it into English. You try that sight translation, that mode. That is a good way to prepare, actually, kind of a rehearsal for your job, for your assignment. And then secondly, you can underline the unknown words or the terms that you think would be key words and key terms, and actually write it down. Prepare a glossary, a list of those terms in alphabetical order, English, Indonesian, or in Indonesian English, and then in Indonesian English. You can do it using Microsoft Excel, of course, and you can actually incorporate those mini glossaries into a big one, and you can actually add a column adding the date and the event for which you interpret it, for which you use those terms in interpreting the materials. And so this is what you can do, and you should actually do, I think. And that's very good. That gives you a very good basis for doing your job more confidently, so to say, because you cannot memorize. Let me just clarify something to you, Ibu Windy. The purpose of reading the material is not to memorize it, because remember, you are not going to interpret like a parrot. You are not going to interpret words. Rather, you will interpret the message. You will convey the message. So by understanding the overall context and you understanding the terms, you will be mentally prepared to actually interpret whatever is being said at that particular time. So don't try to memorize. I don't think it is productive. It's good for an exercise, but it's never productive when you are doing the actual interpretation, unless the speaker will follow the text exactly. Which is rarely the case. Most speakers like to digress. There is conversation, there is question and answer, and you cannot be prepared for everything, but you can be generally prepared by reading through the text, by doing your own research, by preparing your list of terms, and by perhaps even trying to kind of rehearse. But remember, you have to forget that and then focus on the actual speech when you have to interpret it. That would be my answer, Ibu Windy.
Izin Ibu,
Yes, please.
ada 2 pertanyaan dari YouTube ini Bu. Apa berkenan menjawab? Masih ada waktu kira-kira?
Oh, boleh sekali, silakan.
Baik,
I'm all at your yes.
Baik,
Dengan
dari
senang hati.
Mas Agung Kemenkumham, Dear Dr. Meriana, sejauh mana pertanggungjawaban hukum seorang juru bahasa di pengadilan? Apakah mungkin juru bahasa pengadilan dituntut secara hukum karena kesalahannya dalam bertugas di pengadilan? Demikian Ibu.
Wah, ini legalistic question ya. Mudah-mudahan tidak ya Pak ya. Soalnya kalau tidak, nanti tidak ada yang mau jadi penerjemah tersumpah di pengadilan, di sidang pengadilan. Ya, di situ pertama-tama pertama-tama kita sebelum before we actually do, ini dalam bahasa Inggris atau bahasa Indonesia ya? Baiknya bahasa Indonesia. Jadi sebelum kita mulai melakukan tugas kita sebagai penerjemah tersumpah, kita kan diambil sumpahnya. Baik di penerjemah tersumpah berarti udah diambil sumpahnya oleh kepala pemerintah daerah ataupun oleh Kemenkum dan siapapun yang in charge pada saat itu. Kemudian kita berada di bawah sumpah bahwa kita harus menyampaikan apa yang kita dengar dengan baik, tepat, benar, akurat, sesuai dengan apa yang disampaikan. Kalau ada sesuatu kesalahan yang terjadi di dalam sidang pengadilan, dalam penerjemahan, juru bahasa ini hanya membantu pengadilan, membantu penegak hukum, membantu terdakwa atau terlapor atau siapapun untuk melakukan komunikasi antara majelis dan dengan pihak-pihak yang berkaitan. Nah, kalau misal dalam proses membantu itu, dan kita kan mengatakan, saya akan melakukan terjemahan ini sesuai dengan kemampuan, pengetahuan, dan kepercayaan saya, keyakinan saya yang sebaik-baiknya. Nah, ini kalau kita sudah di bawah sumpah seperti itu, ya itu yang harus kita lakukan. Kalau saya melakukan itu, dengan segenap hati, segenap keberadaan saya, dengan segenap pengetahuan saya, maka hanya saya bisa sampai lakukan hanya yang sesuai dengan pengetahuan, kemampuan, dan keyakinan terbaik saya. Itu saja. Jikalau di dalam proses penerjemahan ini terjadi kesalahan, dan itu bisa dicek oleh siapa? Mungkin oleh tim pembela, penuntut, atau sekalipun oleh majelis hakim, maka itu bisa segera dikoreksi di situ. Seandainya pun itu tidak dikoreksi di saat itu juga, masih ada transkrip. Kalau di dalam transkrip itu ada ketidaksesuaian dalam terjemahan, yang terjadi bukan karena kesengajaan, saya tekankan di sini, bukan karena kesengajaan, bukan karena kelalaian, maka itu bisa dikoreksi, tidak perlu sampai dituntut. Jika penerjemah itu lalai atau dengan sengaja memutarbalikkan ya, pesan yang telah disampaikan dan itu diketahui, ya maka dia bisa disqualify sebagai penerjemah tersumpah. Tapi bukan dituntut secara hukum. Karena dia melaksanakan profesinya. Seperti itu jawaban saya. Ini menurut pemikiran saya dan pendapat saya seperti itu. Nah, kalau misalnya dan kemudian ya sebetulnya di sini penerjemah di sidang pengadilan bukan sebagai pihak yang berperkara. Dia hanya membantu, sama halnya seperti panitera, sama halnya seperti yang lain-lain gitu ya. Apakah mereka kalau mereka lalai dalam pelaksanaan tugas mereka kemudian mereka dituntut? Tentu tidak. Bisa saja nanti ada tindakan disipliner. Ada mungkin konsekuensi itu sesuai dengan peraturan di dalam organisasi atau institusi lembaganya. Itu jawaban saya.
Terima kasih. Ibu, pertanyaan terakhir Ibu ya. Dari Ibu Arini Soraya, Sekolah Bahasa Polri. Dear Miss Mariana, I would like to ask you how to do two interpreters. One, simultaneous and consecutive at the same time during the interpreting process. Thank you.
Oh, terima kasih Bu Arini Soraya. Itu canggih sekali ya. Dan memang betul, kita sebagai interpreter harus bisa ya menyesuaikan diri dengan segala macam keadaan. Apalagi dalam situasi-situasi yang menuntut kita kadang-kadang melakukan terjemahan secara simultan. Artinya orangnya bicara, kita juga bicara. Apakah itu kita lakukan dengan menggunakan booth? Apakah kita melakukan itu dengan mendampingi seseorang, dengan membisikkan ya, chuchotage atau whispering translation, which is yang mana merupakan salah satu bentuk dari penerjemahan simultan, atau mungkin ketika orang yang diperiksa kan dia kan harus tahu apa yang terjadi, atau di dalam persidangan kan dia perlu tahu apa yang terjadi dalam persidangan meskipun belum ada pertanyaan ditujukan ke dia. Maka dia berhak dong mengetahui apa yang sedang terjadi. Di situ kita bisa melakukan whispering translation secara simultan. Tetapi ketika si pihak ataupun terdakwa itu ditanya, maksudnya ada pertanyaan diajukan kepada misalnya kepada terdakwa atau terlapor, maka kita akan switch ke mode interpreting yang konsekutif. Atau yang mungkin kalau lebih singkat lagi, ke liaison interpreting. Perbedaan antara konsekutif dan liaison interpreting apa? Dua-duanya dilakukan dengan cara pembicara berbicara beberapa kalimat, kemudian berhenti, dan kemudian penerjemah mencatat, dan kemudian menerjemahkan kembali di dalam bahasa sasaran. Kalau liaison interpreting itu lebih singkat, jadi sama tetapi lebih singkat. Artinya satu kalimat diucapkan langsung diterjemahkan tanpa note taking, Jadi yang mana saja silakan, tergantung dari situasinya. Kalau saya pernah mengalami Bu, benar-benar saya tuh melakukan simultaneous interpreting, kemudian juga consecutive interpreting, tapi bukan dalam di bidang hukum ya, tapi dalam kunjungan kenegaraan. Dan di situ ada satu pidato dari pejabat tinggi yang diterjemahkan oleh penerjemah dari bahasa Indonesia ke bahasa Prancis. Dan saya cuma duduk di situ tidak bertugas karena saya cuma mendengarkan saja. Tapi kelihatannya penerjemah itu tidak berhasil menerjemahkannya dengan jelas. Which is embarrassing ya, kan memalukan sebenarnya. Nah, saya tidak note taking sama sekali, dan itu sebuah pidato ya. Dan kemudian saya cuma mendengarkan saja. Nah, kemudian ada seorang anggota tim mendekati saya, tolong Ibu, setelah ini selesai, Ibu terjemahkan lagi pidato ini dari bahasa Indonesia tadi ke dalam bahasa Inggris. Untuk menyelamatkan situasi, karena dalam terjemahan dari bahasa Indonesia ke Prancis tidak berhasil. Saya tidak mencatat. Ibu bisa bayangkan, saya harus tapi saya mengulangi pidato itu dalam bahasa Inggris dari A sampai Z gitu. Meskipun mungkin tidak sempurna, tetapi the main point saya sudah bisa menyampaikan itu. Artinya saya harus bisa switch dengan sangat cepat, dan itu artinya kita harus selalu siap. Meskipun tidak taking notes, tapi I'm taking mental notes. Jadi itulah Bu, kira-kira salah satu teknik yang bisa diterapkan ketika Ibu berada dalam situasi di mana Ibu harus beralih dari simultaneous interpreting ke consecutive interpreting dan balik lagi. Dan tidak pernah, meskipun kita dikasih tahu, oh ini tidak perlu diterjemahkan, kita tetap note. Dan saya lakukan itu. Saya tetap berdasarkan pengalaman tadi, meskipun saya tidak diminta untuk interpreting, saya tetap note. Saya buat notes. Supaya kalau misalnya pada satu ketika tiba-tiba ternyata perlu disampaikan lagi secara konsekutif, ya saya bisa membantu. Itu Bu, kira-kira mudah-mudahan menjawab pertanyaan Ibu.
Baik, terima kasih Ibu. Terima kasih semuanya yang dari itu. Mudah-mudahan terjawab ya pertanyaannya. Ya, Ibu Mariana dan teman-teman sekalian, suka tidak suka harus kita akhiri karena waktunya sudah sangat lewat dari waktu yang ditentukan. Saya applause untuk kita semua, semuanya bersemangat nih peserta Diklat kali ini. Mudah-mudahan semangat ini akan terus berlanjut sampai dengan tanggal 17 ya, Diklat yang dilaksanakan sampai tanggal 17. Kami ucapkan terima kasih Ibu Mariana, terima kasih kepada seluruh peserta. Jadi tadi yang slide terakhir sangat menginspirasi bahwa untuk menjadi penerjemah itu tidak instan, harus belajar. Bayangkan Bu Mariana sejak tahun 1995 sudah mentranslate hukum Bu ya. Jadi sampai sekarang expert profesional seperti ini tentunya memerlukan proses sangat panjang. Yang satu harus teman-teman tanamkan yaitu bahwa saya yakin bisa mengerjakan Bu ya. Harus ada keyakinan, I can do it, I have done it, done it. I want to do it again and again gitu Bu ya. Kita melakukan percobaan untuk to serve and represent my country to the best of my ability gitu Bu ya. Jadi mudah-mudahan ini menjadi inspirasi kita semua, menjadi inspirasi bagi teman-teman penerjemah untuk menjadi lebih baik ke depannya.
Bapak Moderator, terima kasih. Bolehkah saya mendapat kesempatan untuk mengucapkan beberapa kata terakhir? Iya, untuk menjadi penerjemah ataupun penerjemah lisan atau juru bahasa yang baik, Anda membutuhkan jam terbang. Tetapi Anda tidak akan mendapatkan jam terbang kecuali kalau Anda berani terbang. Jadi Anda harus berani terbang dan bangsa menunjukkan bangsa. Juru bahasa adalah duta bangsa. Terima kasih banyak dan semangat terus. Terima kasih.
Ya, baik peserta sekalian. Kami tutup untuk sesi pertama ini. Setelah ini silakan istirahat, isoma, nanti masuk lagi. Karena waktunya mundur ini nanti masuk jam berapa Mas Yoga?
Kita akan masuk kembali pada pukul 13.45.
13.45 silakan untuk bisa kembali ke tempat diklat masing-masing ya untuk bersama-sama bergabung untuk berikutnya. Baik, terima kasih Ibu. Mohon maaf.
Merdeka. Oke. Terima kasih. Terima kasih.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam. Selamat sukses selalu.
Terima kasih banyak Bu Mariana.
Terima kasih.
Terima kasih Pak Terpuji.